Welcome to this video, and today we're gonna read Of Mice and Men. I hope you enjoy. AFEW miles south of Soldat, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm too, for it has slipped twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. On one side of the river the golden foothill slopes curve up to the strong and rocky Gavilan Mountains, but on the valley side the water is lined with trees, willows fresh and green with every spring, carrying in their lower leaf junctures the debris of the winter's flooding, and sycamores with mottled, white, recumbent limbs and branches that arch over the pool. On the sandy bank under the trees the leaves lie deep and so crisp that a lizard makes a great skittering if he runs among them. Rabbits come out of the brush to sit on the sand in the evening, and the damp flats are covered with the night tracks of coons, and with the spread paths of dogs from the ranches, and with the split-wedge tracks of deer that come to drink in the dark. There is a path through the willows and among the sycamores, a path beaten hard by boys coming down from the ranches to swim in the deep pool, and beaten hard by tramps who come wearily down from the highway in the evening to jungle up near water. In front of the low horizontal limb of a giant sycamore there is an ash pile made by many fires. The limb is worn smooth by men who have sat on it. Evening of a hot day started the little wind to moving among the leaves. The shade climbed up the hills toward the top. On the sand banks the rabbits sat as quietly as little gray, sculptured stones. And then from the direction of the state highway came the sound of footsteps on crisp sycamore leaves. The rabbits hurried noiselessly for cover. A stilted heron labored up into the air and pounded downriver. For a moment the place was lifeless, and then two men emerged from the path and came into the opening by the green pool. They had walked in single file down the path, and even in the open one stayed behind the other. Both were dressed in denim trousers and in denim coats with brass buttons. Both wore black, shapeless hats and both carried tight blanket rolls slung over their shoulders. The first man was small and quick, dark of face, with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. Every part of him was defined: small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin and bony nose. Behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face, with large, pale eyes, with wide, sloping shoulders, and he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little, the way a bear drags his paws. His arms did not swing at his sides, but hung loosely. The first man stopped short in the clearing, and the follower nearly ran over him. He took off his hat and wiped the sweatband with his forefinger and snapped the moisture off. His huge companion dropped his blankets and flung himself down and drank from the surface of the green pool. Drank with long gulps, snorting into the water like a horse. The small man stepped nervously beside him. "Lennie," he said sharply. "Lennie, for God's sakes don't drink so much." Lennie continued to snort into the pool. The small man leaned over and shook him by the shoulder. "Lennie, you gonna be sick like you was last night." Lennie dipped his whole head under, hat and all, and then he sat up on the bank and his hat dripped down on his blue coat and ran down his back. "Thaw's good," he said. "You drink some, George. You take a good big drink." He smiled happily. George unslung his bindle and dropped it gently on the bank. "I ain't sure it's good water," he said. "Looks kinda scummy." Lennie dabbed on at his big paw in the water and wiggled his fingers so the water arose in little splashes. Rings widened across the pool to the other side and came back again. Lennie watched them go. "Look, George, look what I done." George knelt beside the pool and drank from his hand with quick scoops. "Tastes all right," he admitted. "Don't really seem to be running, though." "You never oughta drink water when it ain't running, Lennie," he said hopelessly. "You'd drink out of a gutter if you was thirsty." He threw a scoop of water into his face and rubbed it about with his hand, under his chin and around the back of his neck. Then he replaced his hat, pushed himself back from the river, drew up his knees and embraced it, and Lennie, who had been watching, imitated George exactly. He pushed himself back, drew up his knees, embraced them, looked over to George to see whether he had it just right. He pulled his hat down a little more over his eyes, the way George's hat was. George stared morosely at the water. The rims of his eyes were red with sun glare. He said angrily, "We could just as well have rode clear to the ranch if that bastard bus driver knew what he was talking about." "Just a little stretch down the highway," he says. "Just a little stretch. God damn near 4 miles, that's what it was. Didn't want to stop at the ranch gate, that's what. Too goddamn lazy to pull up. Wonder he isn't too damn good to stop in Soldat at all. Kicks us out and says, just a little stretch down the road. I bet it was more than 4 miles. Damn hot day." Lennie looked timidly over to him. "George." "Yeah, what you want? Where we going, George?" The little man jerked down the brim of his hat and scowled over at Lennie. "So young forgot that already, did you? I gotta tell you again." "Do I? Jesus Christ, you're a crazy bastard." "I forgot," Lennie said softly. "I tried not to forget. Honest to God I did." George. Okay, I'll tell you again. I ain't got nothing to do. Might just as well spend all my time telling you things and then you forget them. And I tell you again. Try and try, said Lennie, but it didn't do no good. I remember about the rabbits, George. The hell with the rabbits. That's all you ever can remember is them rabbits. Okay, now you listen, and this time you got to remember so we don't get in no trouble. You remember sitting in that gutter on Howard Street and watching that blackboard. Lennie's face broke into a delighted smile. Why sure, George, I remember that. But what we do then? I remember some girls come by and you saying, the hell with what I says. You remember about us going into Murray and Reddy's and they give us work cards and bus tickets. Oh, sure, George. I remember that now. His hands went quickly into his side coat pockets. He said gently, George, I ain't got mine. I must have lost it. He looked down at the ground in despair. You never had none, you crazy bastard. I got both of them here. Think I'd let you carry your own work card. Lennie grinned with relief. I thought I put it in my side pocket. His hand went into the pocket again. George looked sharply at it. And what'd you take out of that pocket? Ain't a thing in my pocket, Lennie said cleverly. I know there ain't. You got it in your hand. What you got in your hand, hidden it. I ain't got nothing. George, honest. Come on, give it here. Lennie held his closed hand away from George's direction. It's only a mouse, George. A mouse? A live mouse. Oh, just a dead mouse, George. I didn't kill it. Honest. I found it. I found it dead. Give it here, said George. I'll leave me have it. George, give it her. Lennie's closed hand slowly obeyed. George took the mouse and threw it across the pool to the other side, among the brush. What you want of a dead mouse, anyways? I could pet it with my thumb while we walked along, said Lennie. Well, you ain't petting no mice while you walk with me. You remember where we're going now? Lennie looked startled, and then in embarrassment hit his face against his knees. I forgot again. Jesus Christ, George said resignedly. Well, look, we're gonna work on a ranch like the one we come from up north. In Witt. Oh, sure, I remember. In Witt. That ranch we're going to is right down there about a quarter mile. We're gonna go in and see the boss. Now, look, I'll give him the work tickets, but you ain't gonna say a word. You just stand there and don't say nothing. If he finds out what a crazy bastard you are, we won't get no job. But if he sees you work before he hears a talk, we're set. You got that? Sure, George. Sure, I got it. Okay, now when we go in to see the boss, what you gonna do? Lennie thought. His face grew tight with thought. I ain't gonna say nothing. Just gonna stand there. Good boy. That's swell. You say that over 2-3 times so you sure won't forget it. Lennie droned to himself softly. I ain't gonna say nothing. I ain't gonna say nothing. I ain't gonna say nothing. Okay, said George. And you ain't gonna do no bad things like you done in Witt, neither. Lennie looked puzzled. Like I done in Witt. Oh, so you forgot that too, did ya? Well, I ain't gonna remind you. Fear you do it again. A light of understanding broke on Lennie's face. They run us out of Witt, he exploded triumphantly. Run us out. Hell, said George disgustedly. We run. They was looking for us, but they didn't catch us. Lennie giggled happily. I didn't forget that, you bet. George lay back on the sand and crossed his hands under his head, and Lennie imitated him, raising his head to see whether he were doing it right. God, you're a lot of trouble, said George. I could get along so easy and so nice if I didn't have you on my tail. I could live so easy and maybe have a girl. For a moment Lennie lay quiet, and then he said hopefully, we gonna work on a ranch, George. Alright, you got that, but we're gonna sleep here because I got a reason. The day was going fast now. Only the tops of the Gavilan Mountains flamed with the light of the sun that had gone from the valley. A water snake slipped along on the pool, its head held up like a little periscope. The reeds jerked slightly in the current. Far off toward the highway a man shouted something, and another man shouted back. The sycamore limbs rustled under a little wind that died immediately. George, why ain't we going on to the ranch and get some supper? They got supper at the ranch. George rolled on his side. No reason at all for you. I like it here. Tomorrow we're gonna go to work. I seen thrashing machines on the way down. That means we'll be bucking grain bags, busting a gut. Tonight I'm gonna lay right here and look up. I like it. Lennie got up on his knees and looked down at George. Ain't we gonna have no supper? Sure we are, if you gather up some dead willow sticks. I got 3 cans of beans in my bindle. You get a fire ready. I'll give you a match when you get the sticks together. Then we'll heat the beans and have supper. Lennie said, I like beans with ketchup. Well, we ain't got no ketchup. You go get what? I don't you fool around. It'll be dark before long. Lennie lumbered to his feet and disappeared in the brush. George lay where he was and whistled softly to himself. There were sounds of splashings down the river in the direction Lennie had taken. George stopped whistling and listened. Poor bastard, he said softly, and then went on whistling again. In a moment, Lennie came crashing back through the brush. He carried one small willow stick in his hand. George sat up. "All right," he said brusquely, "shame that mouse." But Lennie made an elaborate pantomime of innocence. "What mouse, George? I ain't got no mouse." George held out his hand. "Come on, give it to me. You ain't putting nothing over." Lennie hesitated, backed away, looked wildly at the brush line as though he contemplated running for his freedom. George said coldly, "You gonna give me that mouse or do I have to sock you?" "Give you what, George? You know goddamn well what. I want that mouse." Lennie reluctantly reached into his pocket. His voice broke a little. "I don't know why I can't keep it. It ain't nobody's mouse. I didn't steal it. I found it lying right beside the road." George's hand remained outstretched imperiously, slowly, like a terrier who doesn't want to bring a ball to its master. Lennie approached, drew back, approached again, and George snapped his fingers sharply, and at the sound Lennie laid the mouse in his hand. "I wasn't doing nothing bad with it, George. Just stroking it." George stood up and threw the mouse as far as he could into the darkening brush, and then he stepped to the pool and washed his hands. "You crazy fool. Don't you think I could see your feet was wet where you went across the river to get it?" He heard Lennie's whimpering cry and wheeled about, blubbering like a baby. "Jesus Christ, a big guy like you." Lennie's lip quivered and tears started in his eyes. "Oh, Lennie." George put his hand on Lennie's shoulder. "I ain't taking it away just for meanness. That mouse ain't fresh, Lennie, and besides, you broke it petting it. You get another mouse that's fresh and I'll let you keep it a little while." Lennie sat down on the ground and hung his head dejectedly. "I don't know where there is no other mouse. I remember a lady used to keep them to me, ever once she got. But that lady ain't here." George scoffed. "Lady, how? Don't even remember who that lady was. That was your own Aunt Clara, and she stopped giving them to ya. You always killed them." Lennie looked sadly up at it. "They was so little," he said, apologetically. "I'd pet them, and pretty soon they bit my fingers and I pinched their heads a little and then they was dead, because they was so little. I wished we'd get the rabbits pretty soon." "George, they ain't so little. The hell with the rabbits. You ain't to be trusted with no live mice. Your Aunt Clara give you a rubber mouse and you wouldn't have nothing to do with it." "It wasn't no good to pet," said Lennie. The flame of the sunset lifted from the mountain tops and dusk came into the valley, and a half-darkness came in among the willows and the sycamores. A big carp rose to the surface of the pool, gulped air and then sank mysteriously into the dark water again, leaving widening rings on the water. Overhead the leaves whisked again and little puffs of willow cotton blew down and landed on the pool's surface. "You gonna get that wood?" George demanded. "There's plenty right up against the back of that sycamore. Floodwater wood. Now you get it." Lennie went behind the tree and brought out a litter of dried leaves and twigs. He threw them in a heap on the old ash pile and went back for more and more. It was almost night now. A dove's wings whistled over the water. George walked to the fire pile and lighted the dry leaves. The flame cracked up among the twigs and fell to work. George undid his bindle and brought out 3 cans of beans. He stood them about the fire, close in against the blaze, but not quite touching the flame. "There's enough beans for 4 men, George said. Lennie watched him from over the fire. He said patiently, "I like 'em with ketchup." "Well, we ain't got any," George exploded. "Whatever we ain't got, that's what you want. God Almighty, if I was alone I could live so easy. I could go get a job and work and no trouble. No mess all. And when the end of the month come, I could take my $50 and go into town and get whatever I want. Why, I could stay in a cat house night. I could eat any place I want, hotel or in place, and order any damn thing I could think of. And I could do all that every damn month. Get a gallon of whiskey, or sit in a pool room and play cards or shoot pool." Lennie knelt and looked over the fire at the angry George, and Lennie's face was drawn with terror. "And what I got," George went on furiously, "I got you. You can't keep a job and you lose me every job I get. Just keep me shoving all over the country all the time. And that ain't the worst. You get in trouble. You do bad things and I gotta get you out." His voice rose nearly to a shout. "You crazy son of a bitch. You keep me in hot water all the time." He took on the elaborate manner of little girls when they are mimicking one another. Just wanted to feel that girl's dress, just wanted to pet it like it was a mouse. Well, how the hell did she know you just wanted to feel her dress? She jerks back and you hold on like it was a mouse. She yells and we got to hide in an irrigation ditch all day with guys looking for us. And we got to sneak out in the dark and get out of the country. All the time, something like that, all the time. I wished I could put you in a cage with about 1,000,000 mice and let you have fun. His anger left him suddenly. He looked across the fire at Lennie's anguished face, and then he looked ashamedly at the flames. It was quite dark now, but the fire lighted the trunks of the trees and the curving branches overhead. Lennie crawled slowly and cautiously around the fire until he was close to George. He sat back on his heels. George turned the bean can so that another side faced the fire. He pretended to be unaware of Lennie so close beside it. George, very softly, no answer. George, what do you want? I was only fooling, George. I don't want no ketchup. I wouldn't eat no ketchup if it was right here beside me. If it was here, you could have some. But I wouldn't eat none, George. I'd leave it all for you. You could cover your beans with it and I wouldn't touch none of it. George still stared morosely at the fire. When I think of the swell time I could have without you, I go nuts. I never get no peace. Lennie still knelt. He looked off into the darkness across the river. George, you want I should go away and leave you alone. Where the hell could you go? Well, I could. I could go off in the hills there. Someplace I'd find a cave. Yeah, how'd you eat? You ain't got sense enough to find nothing to eat. I'd find things. George, I don't need no nice food with ketchup. I'd lay out in the sun and nobody'd hurt me, and if I found a mouse, I could keep it. Nobody'd take it away from me. George looked quickly and searchingly at it. I been mean, ain't I? If you don't want me, I can go off in the hills and find a cave. I can go away any time. No, look, I was just fooling, Lennie, 'cause I want you to stay with me. Trouble with mice is you always kill at them. He paused. Tell you what I'll do, Lennie. First chance I get, I'll give you a pop. Maybe you wouldn't kill it. That'd be better than mice, and you could pet it harder. Lennie avoided the bait. He had sensed his advantage. If you don't want me, you only just got to say so, and I'll go off in those hills right there, right up in those hills and live by myself, and I won't get no mice stole from me. George said, I want you to stay with me, Lennie. Jesus Christ, somebody'd shoot you for a coyote if you was by yourself. No, you stay with me. Your Aunt Clara wouldn't like you running off by yourself, even if she is dead. Lennie spoke craftily. Tell me, like you done before. Tell you what? About the rabbits? George snapped. You ain't gonna put nothing over on me. Lennie, please come on. George, tell me. Please, George. Like you done before. You get a kick out of that, don't you? Alright, I'll tell you, and then we'll eat our supper. George's voice became deeper. He repeated his words rhythmically as though he had said them many times before. Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family. They don't belong no place. They come to a ranch and work up a steak and then they go into town and blow their steak. And the first thing you know they're pounding their tail on some other ranch. They ain't got nothing to look ahead to. Lennie was delighted. That's it. That's it. Now tell how it is with us. George went on. With us it ain't like that. We got a future. We got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about us. We don't have to sit in no bar room blowing our jack just because we got no place else to go. If them other guys gets in jail, they can rot for all anybody gives a damn. But not us. Lennie broke it. But not us. And why? Because I got you to look after me. And you got me to look after you. And that's why. He laughed delightedly. Go on now, George. You got it by heart. You can do it yourself. No, you. I forget some of the things. Tell about how it's gonna be. Okay, someday we're gonna get the jack together and we're gonna have a little house and a couple of acres and a cow and some pigs and live off the fat of the land, Lennie shouted. And have rabbits. Go on, George. Tell about what we're gonna have in the garden and about the rabbits in the cages and about the rain in the winter and the stove and how thick the cream is and the milk like you can hardly cut it. Tell about that, George. Why don't you do it yourself? You know all of it. No, you tell it. It ain't the same if I tell it. Go on, George. How I get to tend the rabbits? Well, said George, we'll have a big vegetable patch and a rabbit hutch and chickens. And when it rains in the winter, we'll just say the hell with going to work. And we'll build up a fire in the stove and sit around it and listen to the rain coming down on the roof. Nuts. He took out his pocket knife. I ain't got time for no more. He drove his knife through the top of one of the bean cans, sawed out the top, and passed the can to Lennie. Then he opened a second can. From his side pocket he brought out 2 spoons and passed one of them to Lennie. They sat by the fire and filled their mouths with beans and chewed mightily. A few beans slipped out of the side of Lennie's mouth. George gestured with his spoon. What you gonna say tomorrow when the boss asks you questions? Lennie stopped chewing and swallowed. His face was concentrated. I ain't gonna say a word. Good boy. That's fine, Lennie. Maybe you're getting better. When we get the couple of acres, I can let you tend the rabbits alright. Especially if you remember as good as that. Lennie choked with pride. I can remember, he said. George motioned with his spoon again. Look, Lennie, I want you to look around here. You can remember this place, can't you? The ranch is about a quarter mile up that way. Just follow the river. Sure, said Lennie. I can remember this. Didn't I remember about not gonna say a word? Course you did. Well, look, Lennie, if you just happen to get in trouble like you always done before, I want you to come right here and hide in the brush. Hide in the brush, said Lennie slowly. Hide in the brush till I come for you. Can you remember that? Sure I can, George. Hide in the brush till you come. But you ain't gonna get in no trouble, because if you do, I won't let you tend the rabbits. He threw his empty bean can off into the brush. I won't get in no trouble, George. I ain't gonna say a word. Okay, bring your bindle over here by the fire. It's gonna be nice sleeping here, looking up and the leaves. Don't build up no more fire. We'll let her die down. They made their beds on the sand, and as the blaze dropped from the fire, the sphere of light grew smaller. The curling branches disappeared, and only a faint glimmer showed where the tree trunks were. From the darkness, Lennie called, "George, you asleep?" "No, what do you want?" "Let's have different colored rabbits, George." "Sure we will," George said sleepily. "Red and blue and green rabbits, Lennie, millions of them. Furry ones, George, like I seen in the fair in Sacramento." "Sure, furry ones. 'Cause I can just as well go away, George, and live in a cave." "You can just as well go to hell," said George. "Shut up now." The red light dimmed on the coals. Up the hill from the river a coyote hammered, and a dog answered from the other side of the street. The sycamore leaves whispered in a little night breeze. Chapter 2. The bunkhouse was a long, rectangular building. Inside, the walls were whitewashed and the floor unpainted. In 3 walls there were small, square windows, and in the 4th, a solid door with a wooden latch. Against the walls were 8 bunks, 5 of them made up with blankets and the other 3 showing their burlap ticking. Over each bunk there was nailed an apple box with the opening forward so that it made 2 shelves for the personal belongings of the occupant of the bunk. And these shelves were loaded with little articles, soap and talcum powder, razors, and those western magazines ranchmen loved to read and scoff at and secretly believe. And there were medicines on the shelves, and little vials, combs, and from nails on the box sides, a few neckties. Near one wall there was a black cast iron stove, its stovepipe going straight up through the ceiling. In the middle of the room stood a big square table littered with playing cards, and around it were grouped boxes for the players to sit on. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun threw a bright dust-laden bar through one of the side windows, and in and out of the beam flies shot like rushing stars. The wooden latch raised. The door opened and a tall, stoop-shouldered old man came in. He was dressed in blue jeans and he carried a big push broom in his left hand. Behind him came George, and behind George, Lennie. "The boss was expecting you last night," the old man said. "He was sore as hell when you wasn't here to go out this morning." He pointed with right arm, and out of the sleeve came a round stick-like wrist, but no hand. "You can have them 2 beds there," he said, indicating 2 bunks near the stove. George stepped over and threw his blankets due on the burlap sack of straw that was a mattress. He looked into his box shelf and then picked a small yellow can from it. "Say, what the hell's this?" "I don't know," said the old man. "Says positively kills lice, roaches, and other scourges." "What the hell kind of bed you giving us, anyways? We don't want no pens, rabbits." The old swamper shifted his broom and held it between his elbow and his side while he held out his hand for the can. He studied the label carefully. "Tell you what," he said finally. "Last guy that had Ty's bed was a blacksmith. Hell of a nice fella and clean a guy as you want to meet. Used to wash his hands even after he ate. Then how come he got graybacks?" George working up a slow anger. Lennie put his bindle on the neighboring bunk and sat down. He watched George with open mouth. "Tell you what," said the old swamper. "This here blacksmith, name of Whitey, was the kind of guy that would put that stuff around even if there wasn't no bugs, just to make sure, see? Tell you what he used to do. At meals he'd peel his boiled potatoes, and he'd take out every little spot, no matter what kind, before he'd eat it. And if there was a red splotch on an egg, he'd scrape it off. Finally quit about the food. That's the kind of guy he was, clean. Used to dress up Sundays even when he wasn't going no place, put on a necktie even, and then sat in the bunkhouse." "I ain't so sure," said George skeptically. "What did you say he quit for?" The old man put the yellow can in his pocket, and he rubbed his bristly white whiskers with his knuckles. "Why, he just quit the way a guy will. Says it was the food. Just wanted to move. Didn't give no other reason but the food. Just says give me my time one night, the way any guy would." George lifted his stick and looked underneath it. He leaned over and inspected the sacking closely. Immediately Lennie got up and did the same with his bed. Finally George seemed satisfied. He unrolled his bindle and put things on the shelf, his razor and bar of soap, his comb and bottle of pills, his liniment and leather wristband. Then he made his bed up neatly with blankets. The old man said, "I guess the boss'll be out here in a minute. He was sure buried when you wasn't here this morning. Come right in when we was eating breakfast and says, 'Where the hell's them new men?' And he give the stable buck hell, too." George patted a wrinkle out of his bed and sat down. "Give the stable buck hell?" he asked. "Sure, you see the stable buck's a nigger." "Nigger, how?" "Yeah, nice fella too. Not a crooked back where a horse kicked it in. The boss gives him hell when he's mad. But the stable buck don't give a damn about that. He reads a lot. That book's in his room. What kind of a guy is the boss? George asked. Well, he's a pretty nice fella. Dad's pretty mad sometimes, but he's pretty nice. Tell you what, know what he done Christmas? Grind a gallon of whiskey right in here and say drink hearty boys. Christmas comes but once a year. The hell he did? Whole gallon. Yes, sir. Jesus, we had fun. They let the nigger come in that night. Little skitter named of Smithy took after the nigger. Done pretty good, too. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so the nigger got it. If he coulda used his feet, Smithy says he woulda killed the nigger. The guys said on account of the nigger's got a crooked back, Smithy can't use his feet. He paused in relish of the memory. After that the guys went into Soldat and raised hell. Didn't go in there. I ain't got the poop no more. Lennie was just finishing making his bed. The wooden latch raised again and the door opened. A little stocky man stood in the open doorway. He wore blue jean trousers, a flannel shirt, a black unbuttoned vest and a black coat. His thumbs were stuck in his belt, on each side of a square steel buckle. On his head was a soiled brown Stetson hat, and he wore high-heeled boots and spurs to prove he was not a laboring man. The old swamper looked quickly at him, and then shuffled to the door rubbing his whiskers with his knuckles as he went. Them guys just come, he said, and shuffled past the boss and out the door. The boss stepped into the room with the short, quick steps of a fat-legged man. I wrote Murray and Reddy I wanted 2 men this morning. You got your work slips. George reached into his pocket and produced the slips and handed them to the boss. It wasn't Murray and Reddy's fault. Says right here on the slip that you was to be here for work this morning. George looked down at his feet. Bus driver give us a bum steer, he said. We had to walk 10 miles. Says we was here when we wasn't. We couldn't get no rides in the morning. The boss squinted his eyes. Well, I had to send out the grain team short 2 buckers. Won't do any good to go out now till after dinner. He pulled his time book out of his pocket and opened it where a pencil was stuck between the leaves. George scowled meaningfully at Lennie, and Lennie nodded to show that he understood. The boss licked his pencil. What's your name? George Milton. And what's yours? George said, his name's Lennie Small. The names were entered in the book. Let's see, this is the 20th, not the 20th. He closed the book. Where you boys been working? Up around wheat, said George. You too. To Lennie. Yeah, him too, said George. The boss pointed a playful finger at Lennie. He ain't much of a talker, is he? No, he ain't, but he's sure a hell of a good worker. Strong as a bull. Lennie smiled to himself. Strong as a bull. He repeated. George scowled at him, and Lennie dropped his head in shame at having forgotten. The boss said suddenly, listen, smile. Lennie raised his head. What can you do? In a panic, Lennie looked at George for help. He can do anything you don't tell him, said George. He a good skinner. He can rustle grain bags, drive cultivator. He can do anything. Just give him a try. The boss turned on George. Then why don't you let him answer? What are you trying to put over? George broke in loudly. Oh, I ain't saying he's bright. He ain't, but I say he's a goddamn good worker. He can put up a 400-pound bale. The boss deliberately put the little book in his pocket. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and squinted, one eye nearly closed. Say, what you sellin'? How I said, what stake you got in this guy? You taking his pay away from him? No, course I ain't. Why you think I'm selling him out? Well, I never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy. I just like to know what your interest is. George said, he's my cousin. I told his old lady I'd take care of it. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. He's alright. Just ain't bright. But he can do anything you tell him. The boss turned half away. Well, God knows we don't need any brains to pack barley bags. Why don't you try to put nothing over it, Milton? I got my eye on you. Why'd you quit and wait? Job was done, said George promptly. What kind of job? We was digging a cesspool. Alright, but don't try to put nothing over, cause you can't get away with nothing. I seen wise guys before. Go on out with the grain teams after dinner. They're picking up barley at the threshing machine. Go out with Slim's team. Slim, yeah, big tall Skinner. You'll see him at dinner. He turned abruptly and went to the door, but before he went out he turned and looked for a long moment at the 2 men. When the sound of his footsteps had died away, George turned on Lennie. So you wasn't gonna say a word. You was gonna leave your big flapper shut and leave me do the talking. Damn near lost us the job. Lennie stared hopelessly at his hands. I forgot, George. Yeah, you forgot. You always forget, and I got to talk you out of it. He sat down heavily on the bunk. Now he's got his eye on us. Now we got to be careful and not make no slips. You keep your big wrapper shut after this. He fell morosely silent. George, what you want now? I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was I, George? Be a damn good thing if you was, George said viciously. Saved everybody a hell of a lot of trouble. You said I was your cousin, George. Well, that was a lie, and I'm damn glad it was. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself. He stopped suddenly, stepped to the open front door and peered out. Say, what the hell you doing, Lightman? The old man came slowly into the road. He had his broom in his hand, and at his heels there walked a drag-footed sheepdog, gray of muzzle, and with pale, blind old eyes. The dog struggled lamely too. At the side of the room and lay down, grunting softly eyed to himself and licking his grizzled, moth-eaten coat. The swamper watched him until he was settled. I wasn't listening. I was just standing in the shade a minute scratching my dog. I just now finished swamping out the wash house. You was poking your big ears into our business, George said. I don't like nobody to get nosy. The old man looked uneasily from George to Lennie, and then back. I just come there, he said. I didn't hear nothing you guys was saying. I ain't interested in nothing you was saying. A guy on a ranch don't never listen nor he don't ask no questions. Damn right he don't, said George, slightly mollified, not if he wants to stay. Working long. He was reassured by the swamper's defense. Come on in and sit down a minute, he said. That's a hell of an old dog. Yeah, I had him ever since he was a pup. God, he was a good sheepdog when he was younger. He stood his broom against the wall and he rubbed his white bristled cheek with his knuckles. How do you like the boss? He asked. Pretty good. Seemed alright. He's a nice fella, the swamper agreed. You got to take him right. At that moment a young man came into the bunkhouse. A thin young man with a brown face, with brown eyes and a head of tightly curled hair. He wore a work glove on his left hand, and, like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. See my old man? He asked. The swamper said. He was here just a minute ago. Curly went over to the cookhouse, I think. I'll try to catch him, said Curly. His eyes passed over the new man, and he stopped. He glanced coldly at George and then at Lennie, his arms gradually bending at the elbows and his hands closed into fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. Lennie squirmed under the look and shifted his feet nervously. Curly stepped gingerly close to him. You the new guys the old man was waiting for. We just come in, said George. Let the big gay talk. Lennie twisted with embarrassment. George said, I suppose he don't want to talk. Curly lashed his body around. By Christ, he's gotta talk when he's spoke to. What the hell are you getting into it for? We traveled together, said George coldly. Oh, so it's that way. George was tense and motionless. Yeah, it's that way. Lennie was looking helplessly to George for instruction. A young one let the big guy talk, is that it? He can talk if he wants to tell you anything. He nodded slightly to Lennie. We just come in, said Lennie softly. Curly stared levelly at him. Well, next time you answer when you're spoke to. He turned toward the door and walked out, and his elbows were bent out a little. George watched him out, and then he turned back to the swamper. Say, what the hell's he got on his shoulder? Lennie didn't do nothing to him. The old man looked cautiously at the door to make sure no one was listening. That's the boss's son, he said quietly. Curly's pretty handy. He done quite a bit in the ring. He's a lightweight and he's handy. Well, let him be handy, said George. He don't have to take after Lennie. Lennie didn't do nothing to him. What's he got against Lennie? The swamper considered. Well, tell you what, Curly's like a lot of little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys. Kind of like he's mad at them because he ain't a big guy. You seen little guys like that, ain't you? Always scrappy. Sure, said George. I seen plenty tough little guys. But this Curly better not make no mistakes about Lennie. Lennie ain't handy, but this Curly punk is gonna get hurt if he messes around with Lennie. Well, Curly's pretty handy, the swamper said skeptically. Never did seem right to me. I suppose Curly jumps a big guy and licks it. Everybody says what a game guy Curly is. And I suppose he does the same thing and gets licked. Then everybody says the big guy ought to pick somebody his own size, and maybe they gang up on the big guy. Never did seem right to me. Seems like Curly ain't giving nobody a chance. George was watching the door. He said ominously, well, he better watch out for Lennie. Lennie ain't no fighter, but Lennie's strong and quick, and Lennie don't know no rules. He walked to the square table and sat down on one of the boxes. He gathered some of the cards together and shuffled them. The old man sat down on another box. Don't tell Curly I said none of this. He'd slough me. He just don't give a damn. Won't ever get canned cause his old man's the boss. George got the cards and began turning them over, looking at each one and throwing it down on a pile. He said, this guy Curly sounds like a son of a bitch to me. I don't like mean little guys. Seems to me like he's worse lately, said the swamper. He got married a couple of weeks ago. Wife lives over in the boss's house. Seems like Curly is cockering ever since he got married. George grunted. Maybe he's showing off for his wife. The swamper warmed to his gossip. You seen that glove on his left hand? Yeah, I seen it. Well, that glove's full of Vaseline. Vaseline? What the hell for? Well, I tell you what, Curly says he's keeping that hand soft for his wife. George studied the cards absorbedly. That's a dirty thing to tell around, he said. The old man was reassured. He had drawn a derogatory statement from George. He felt safe now, and he spoke more confidently. Wait till you see Curly's wife. George cut the cards again and put out a solitaire lay, slowly and deliberately. Birdie, he asked casually. Yeah, Birdie, but George studied his cards. But what? Well, she got the eye. Yeah. Married 2 weeks and got the eye. Maybe that's why Curly's pants is full of ants. I seen her give Slim the eye. Slim's a jerkline skinner. Hell of a nice fella. Slim don't need to wear no high-heeled boots on a grain team. I seen her give Slim the eye. Curly never seen it. And I seen her give Carlson the eye. George pretended a lack of interest. Looks like we was gonna have fun. A swamper stood up from his box. Know what I think? George did not answer. Well, I think Curly's married. A tart. He ain't the first, said George. There's plenty done that. The old man moved toward the door, and his ancient dog lifted his head and peered about, and then got painfully to his feet to follow. I gotta be setting out the wash basins for the guys. The teams will be in before long. You guys gonna buck barley? Yeah. You won't tell Curly nothing I said. Hell no. Well, you look her over, mister. You see if she ain't a tart. He stepped out the door into the brilliant sunshine. George laid down his cards thoughtfully, turned his piles of 3. He built 4 clubs on his ace pile. His sun square was on the floor now, and the flies whipped through it like sparks. A sound of jingling harness, and the croak of heavy-laden axles sounded from outside. From the distance came a clear call. Stable buck, oh, stable buck. And then, where the hell is that goddamn nigger? George stared at his solitaire leg, and then he flounced the cards together and turned around to Lennie. Lennie was lying down on the bunk watching it. Look, Lennie, this here ain't no setup. I'm scared. You gonna have trouble with that Curly guy. I seen that kind before. He was kinda feeling you out. He figures he's got you scared and he's gonna take a sock at you the first chance he gets. Lennie's eyes were frightened. I don't want no trouble, he said plaintively. Don't let him sock me, George. George got up and went over to Lennie's bunk and sat down on it. I hate that kind of bastard, he said. I seen plenty of them. Like the old guy says, Curly don't take no chances. He always wins. He thought for a moment. If he tangles with you, Lennie, we're gonna get the can. Don't make no mistake about that. He's the boss's son. Look, Lennie, you try to keep away from him, will you? Don't never speak to it. If he comes in here, you move clear to the other side of the road. Will you do that, Lennie? I don't want no trouble, Lennie Mort. I never done nothing to him. Well, that won't do you no good if Curly wants to pluck himself up for a fighter. Just don't have nothing to do with him. Will you remember? Sure, George. I ain't gonna say a word. The sound of the approaching grain teams was louder. Thud of big hooves on hard ground, drag of brakes and the jingle of trace chains. Men were calling back and forth from the teams. George, sitting on the bunk beside Lennie, frowned as he thought Lennie asked timidly, You ain't mad, George. I ain't mad at you. I'm mad at this here Curly bastard. I hoped we was gonna get a little steak together, maybe $100. His tone grew decisive. You keep away from Curly, Lennie. Sure I will, George. I won't say a word. Don't let him pull you in, but if the son of a bitch sucks you, let him have it. Let him have what, George? Never mind, never mind. I'll tell you when. I hate that kind of a guy. Look, Lennie, if you get in any kind of trouble, you remember what I told you to do. Lennie raised up on his elbow, his face contorted with thought. Then his eyes moved sadly to George's face. If I get in any trouble, you ain't gonna let me tend the rabbits. That's not what I meant. You remember where we slept last night? Down by the river? Yeah. I remember. Oh, sure I remember. I go there and hide in the brush. Hide till I come for you. Don't let nobody see you. Hide in the brush by the river. Say that over. Hide in the brush by the river. Down in the brush by the river. If you get in trouble. If I get in trouble. A brake screeched outside. A call came. Stable buck. I'll stable buck. George said. Say it over to yourself, Lennie, so you won't forget it. Both men glanced up, for the rectangle of sunshine in the doorway was cut off. A girl was standing there looking in. She had full, bruised lips and wide-spaced eyes, heavily made up. Her fingernails were red. Her hair hung in little rolled clusters, like sausages. She wore a cotton house dress and red mules, on the insteps of which were little bouquets of red ostrich feathers. I'm looking for Curly, she said. Her voice had a nasal, brittle quality. George looked away from her, and then back. He was in here a minute ago, but he went. She put her hands behind her back and leaned against the door frame so that her body was thrown forward. You're the new fellas that just come, ain't ya? Yeah. Lennie's eyes moved down over her body, and though she did not seem to be looking at Lennie, she bridled a little. She looked at her fingernails. Sometimes Corley's in here, she explained. George said brusquely, well, he ain't now. If he ain't, I guess I better look someplace else, she said playfully. Lennie watched her, fascinated. George said, if I see him, I'll pass the word you was looking for him. She smiled archly and twitched her body. Nobody can't blame a person for looking, she said. There were footsteps behind her, going by. She turned her head. Hi, Slim, she said. Slim's voice came through the door. Hi, good looking. I'm trying to find Curly, Slayton. Well, you ain't trying very hard. I seen him going in your house. She was suddenly apprehensive. Bye, boys, she called into the bunkhouse, and she hurried away. George looked around at Lennie. Jesus, what a tramp, he said. So that's what Curly picks for a wife. She's pretty, said Lennie defensively. Yeah, and she's sure hitting it. Curly got his work ahead of him. Bedsheet clear out for $20. Lennie still stared at the doorway where she had been. Gosh, she was pretty. He smiled admiringly. George looked quickly down at him, and then he took him by an ear and shook it. Listen to me, you crazy bastard, he said fiercely. Don't you even take a look at that bitch. I don't care what she says and what she does. I seen em poisoned before, but I never seen no piece of jailbait worse than her. You leave her be. Lennie tried to disengage his ear. I never done nothing, George. No, you never. But when she was standing in the doorway showing her legs, you wasn't looking the other way, neither. I never meant no harm, George. Honest, I never. Well, you keep away from her, cause she's a rat trap if I ever seen one. You let Curly take the rap. He let himself in for it. Glove full of Vaseline, George said disgustedly, and I bet he's eating raw eggs and reading to the patent medicine houses. Lennie cried out suddenly, I don't like this place, George. This ain't no good place. I wanna get out of here. We gotta keep it till we get a stake. We can't help it, Lennie. We'll get out just as soon as we can. I don't like it no better than you do. He went back to the table and set out a new solitaire hand. No, I don't like it, he said. For 2 bits I'd shove out of here. If we can get just a few dollars in the poke, we'll shove off and go up the American River and Pango. We can make maybe a couple of dollars a day there, and we might hit a pocket. Lennie leaned eagerly toward him. Let's go, George. Let's get out of here. It's mean here. We gotta stay. George said shortly. Shut up now. The guys'll be cumin in. From the washroom nearby came the sound of running water and rattling basins. George studied the cards. Maybe we ought to wash up, he said. But we ain't done nothing to get dirty. A tall man stood in the doorway. He held a crushed Stetson hat under his arm while he combed his long, black, damp hair straight back. Like the others, he wore blue jeans and a short denim jacket. When he had finished combing his hair, he moved into the room, and he moved with a majesty only achieved by royalty and master craftsmen. He was a jerkline skidder, the prince of the ranch, capable of driving 10, 16, even 20 mules with a single line to the leaders. He was capable of killing a fly on the wheelers but with a bullwhip without touching the mule. There was a gravity in his manner and a quiet so profound that all talk stopped when he spoke. His authority was so great that his word was taken on any subject, be it politics or law. This was Slim, the jerkline skinner. His hatchet face was ageless. He might have been 35 or 50. His ear heard more than was said to him, and his slow speech had overtones not of thought, but of understanding beyond thought. His hands, large and lean, were as delicate in their action as those of a temple dancer. He smoothed out his crushed hat, creased it in the middle and put it on. He looked kindly at the two in the bunkhouse. It's brighter than a beach outside, he said gently. Can't hardly see nothing in here. You the new guys. Just come, said George. Gonna buck barley, that's what the boss says. Slim sat down on a box across the table from George. He studied the solitaire hand that was upside down to him. Hope you get on my team, he said. His voice was very gentle. I got a pair of punks on my team that don't know a barley bag from a blue ball. You guys ever bucked any barley? Hell, yes, said George. I ain't nothing to scream about, but that big bastard there can put up more grain alone than most bears can. Lennie, who had been following the conversation back and forth with his eyes, smiled complacency at the compliment. Slim looked approvingly at George for having given the compliment. He leaned over the table and snapped the corner of a loose card. You guys travel around together. His tone was friendly. It invited confidence without demanding it. Sure, said George. We kinda look after each other. He indicated Lennie with his thumb. He ain't bright. Hell of a good worker, though. Hell of a nice fella, but he ain't bright. I've knew him for a long time. Slim looked through George and beyond it. Ain't many guys travel around together, he mused. I don't know why. Maybe everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other. It's a lot nicer to go around with a guy you know, said George. A powerful, big-stomached man came into the bunkhouse. His head still dripped water from the scrubbing and dousing. Hi, Slim, he said, and then stopped and stared at George and Lennie. These guys just come, said Slim by way of introduction. Glad to meet ya, the big man said. My name's Carlson. I'm George Milton. This here's Lennie Small. Glad to meet ya, Carlson said again. He ain't very small. He chuckled softly at his joke. Ain't small at all, he repeated. Meant to ask you, Slim, how's your bitch? I seen she wasn't under your wagon this morning. She slanged her pups last night, said Slim. 9 of them. I drowned 4 of them right off. She couldn't feed that many. Got 5 left. Huh? Yeah, 5. I kept the biggest. What kind of dogs you think they're gonna be? I dunno, said Slavin. Some kind of shepherds, I guess. That's the most kind I seen around here when she was in heat. Carlson went on. Got 5 pups. Ha, gonna keep all of them. I dunno. Have to keep them a while so they can drink Lulu's milk. Carlson said thoughtfully, well, look a here, Slavin. I've been thinking them. That dog of Candy's is so goddamn old he can't hardly walk. Stinks like hell, too. Every time he comes into the bunkhouse I can smell him for 2-3 days. Why don't you get Candy to shoot his old dog and give him one of the pups to raise up? I can smell that dog a mile away. Got no teeth, damn near blind. Can't eat it. Candy feeds him milk. He can't chew nothing else. George had been staring intently at Slim. Suddenly a triangle began to ring outside, slowly at first and then faster and faster until the beat of it disappeared into one ringing sound. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. There she goes, said Carlson. Outside, there was a burst of voices as a group of men went by. Slim stood up slowly and with dignity. You guys better come on while there's still something to eat. Won't be nothing left in a couple of minutes. Carlson stepped back to let Slim precede him, and then the 2 of them went out the door. Lennie was watching George excitedly. George rumpled his cards into a messy pile. Yeah, George said. I heard him. Lennie, I'll ask it. A brown and white one. Lennie cried excitedly. Come on, let's get dinner. I don't know whether he got a brown and white one. Lennie didn't move from his bunk. You ask him right away, George, so he won't kill no more of it then. Sure, come on now, get up on your feet. Lennie rolled off his bunk and stood up, and the 2 of them started for the door. Just as they reached it, Curly bounced in. You seen a girl around here? He demanded angrily. George said coldly. About half an hour ago maybe. Well, what the hell was she doing? George stood still, watching the angry little man. He said insultingly, she said. She was looking for you. Curly seemed really to see George for the first time. His eyes flashed over George, took in his height, measured his reach, looked at his trim middle. Well, which way'd she go? He demanded at last. I dunno, said George. I didn't watch her go. Curly scowled at him, and turning, hurried out the door. George said, you know, Lennie, I'm scared I'm gonna tangle with that bastard myself. I hate his guts. Jesus Christ. Come on. They won't be a damn thing left to eat. They went out the door. His sunshine lay in a thin line under the window. From a distance there could be heard a rattle of dishes. After a moment the ancient dog walked lamely in through the open door. He gazed about with mild, half-blind eyes. He sniffed and then lay down and put his head between his paws. Curly popped into the doorway again and stood looking into the road. The dog raised his head. But when Curly jerked out, the grizzled head sank to the floor again. Chapter 3. Although there was evening brightness showing through the windows of the bunkhouse, inside it was dusk. Through the open door came the thuds and occasional clangs of a horseshoe game, and now and then the sound of voices raised in approval or derision. Slim and George came into the darkening bunkhouse together. Slim reached up over the card table and turned on the tin-shaded electric light. Instantly the table was brilliant with light, and the cone of the shade threw its brightness straight downward, leaving the corners of the bunkhouse still in dusk. Slim sat down on a box and George took his place opposite. It wasn't nothing, said Slavin. I would have had to drown most of them anyways. No need to thank me about that. George said, it wasn't much to you, maybe, but it was a hell of a lot to me. Jesus Christ, I don't know how we're gonna get him to sleep in here. He'll want to sleep right out in the barn with Ethan. We'll have trouble keeping him from getting right in the box with them pups. It wasn't nothing, Slim repeated. Say, you sure was right about it. Maybe he ain't right. But I never seen such a worker. He damn near killed his partner Buck and Barley. There ain't nobody can keep up with him. God almighty, I never seen such a strong guy. George spoke proudly. Just tell Lennie what to do and he'll do it if it don't take no figuring. He can't think of nothing to do himself, but he sure can take orders. There was a clang of horseshoe on iron stake outside and a little cheer of voices. Slim moved back slightly so the light was not on his face. Funny how you and him string along together. It was Slim's calm invitation to confidence. What's funny about it? George demanded defensively. Oh, I don't know. Hardly none of the guys ever travel together. I hardly never seen two guys travel together. You know how the hands are. They just come in and get their bunk and work a month, and then they quit and go out alone. Never seem to give a damn about nobody. It just seems kinda funny a cuckoo like him and a smart little guy like you traveling together. He ain't no cuckoo, said George. He's dumb as hell. But he ain't crazy, and I ain't so bright neither, or I wouldn't be bucking barley for my 50 and found. If I was bright, if I was even a little bit smart, I'd have my own little place and I'd be bringing in my own crops. Instead of doing all the work and not getting what comes up out of the ground. George fell silent. He wanted to talk. Slim neither encouraged nor discouraged him. He just sat back quiet and receptive. It ain't so funny, him and me going around together, George said at last. Him and me was both born in Auburn. I know this Aunt Clara. She took him when he was a baby and raised him up. When his Aunt Clara died, Lennie just come along with me out working. Got kinda used to each other after a little while. Said Slim. George looked over at Slim and saw the calm, godlike eyes fastened on him. Funny, said George. I used to have a hell of a lot of fun with him. Used to play jokes on him cause he was too dumb to take care of himself. But he was too dumb even to know he had a joke played on it. I had fun. Made me seem goddamn smart alongside of him. Why he'd do any damn thing I tell hits. If I tell him to walk over a cliff, over he'd go. That wasn't so damn much fun after a while. He never got mad about it, neither. I beat the hell out of him, and he could have bust every bone in my body just with his hands, but he never lifted a finger against me. George's voice was taking on the tone of confession. Tell you what made me stop that. One day a bunch of guys was standing around up on the Sacramento River. I was feeling pretty smart. I turns to Lennie and says, jump it. And he jumps, couldn't swim a stroke. He damn near drowned before we could get it, and he was so damn nice to me for pulling him out. Clean forgot I told him to jump it. Well, I ain't done nothing like that no more. He's a nice fella, said Slayton. Guy don't need no sense to be a nice fella. Seems to me sometimes it just works the other way around. Take a real smart guy and he ain't hardly ever a nice fella. George stacked the scattered cards and began to lay out his solitaire hand. The shoes thudded on the ground outside. At the windows, the light of the evening still made the window squares bright. I ain't got no people, George said. I seen the guys that go around on the ranches alone. That ain't no good. They don't have no fun. After a long time they get me. They get wanting to fight all the time. Yeah, they get mean, Slim agreed. They get so they don't want to talk to nobody. Course Lennie's a goddamn nuisance most of the time, said George. But you get used to going around with a guy and you can't get rid of it. He ain't mean, said Slayton. I can see Lennie ain't a bit mean. Course he ain't mean. But he gets in trouble all the time because he's so goddamn dumb. Like what happened in Weed, he stopped in the middle of turning over a car. He looked alarmed and peered over at Slim. You wouldn't tell nobody what he doing with? Slim asked calmly. You wouldn't tell? No, course you wouldn't. What he doing with? Slim asked again. Well, he seen this girl in a red dress. Dumb bastard like he is. He wants to touch everything he likes. Just wants to feel it. So he reaches out to feel this red dress and the girl lets out a squawk. And that gets Lennie all mixed up. And he holds on cause that's the only thing he can think to do. Well, this girl squawks and squawks. Was just a little bit off. And I heard all the yelling. So I comes running. And by that time Lennie's so scared all he can think to do is just hold on. I socked him over the head with a fence picket to make him let go. He was so scared he couldn't let go of that dress. And he's so goddamn strong, you know. Slim's eyes were level and unwinking. He nodded very slowly. So what happens? George carefully built his line of solitaire cards. Well, that girl rabbits in and tells the law she been raped. The guys in Weed start a party out to lynch Lennie. So we sit in an irrigation ditch underwater all the rest of that day. Got only our heads sticking out of water and up under the grass that sticks out from the side of the ditch. And that night we scrammed out of there. Slim sat in silence for a moment. Didn't hurt the girl none. How? He asked finally. Hell no. He just scared her. I'd be scared too if he grabbed me. But he never hurt her. He just wanted to touch that red dress like he wants to pet them pups all the time. He ain't mean, said Slayton. I can tell a mean guy a mile off. Course he ain't. And he'll do any damn thing I let him came in through the door. He wore his blue denim coat over his shoulders like a cape, and he walked hunched way over. Hi, Lennie, said George. How you like the pup now? Lennie said breathlessly. He's brown and white just like I wanted. He went directly to his bunk and lay down and turned his face to the wall and drew up his knees. George put down his cards very deliberately. Lennie, he said sharply. Lennie twisted his neck and looked over his shoulder. What you want, George? I told you you couldn't bring that pup in here. What pup, George? I ain't got no pup. George went quickly to him, grabbed him by the shoulder and rolled him over. He reached down and picked the tiny puppy from where Lennie had been concealing it against his stomach. Lennie sat up quickly. Give unto me, George. George said, you get right up and take this pup back to the nest. He's got asleep with his mother. You want to kill him. Just born last night and you take him out of the nest. You take him back or I'll tell Slim not to let you have it. Lennie held out his hands pleadingly. Give unto me, George. I'll take him back. I didn't mean no harm, George. Honest, I didn't. I just wanted to pet him a little. George handed the pup to him. Alright, you get him back there quick, and don't you take him out no more. You'll kill him. The first thing you know, Lennie fairly scuttled out of the room. Slim had not moved. His calm eyes followed Lennie out the door. Jesus, he said. He's just like kid, ain't he? Sure, he's just like a kid. There ain't no more harm in him than a kid neither, except he's so strong. I bet he won't come in here to sleep tonight. He'd sleep right alongside that box in the bar. Well, let it in. He ain't doing no harm out there. It was almost dark outside now. Old Candy, the swamper, came in and went to his bunk, and behind him struggled his old dog. Hello, Slimmy. Hello, George. Didn't neither of you play horseshoes? I don't like to play every night, said Slimmy. Candy went on. Either you guys got a slug of whiskey. I got a good ache. I ain't, said Slimmy. I'd drink it myself if I had, and I ain't got a good ache neither. Got a bad good ache, said Candy. Then God, damn turnips, give it to me. I knowed they was going to before I ever eat at them. The thick-bodied Carlson came in out of the darkening yard. He walked to the other end of the bunkhouse and turned on the second shaded light. Darker hell in here, he said. Jesus, how that nigger can pitch shoes. He's plenty good, said Slimmy. Damn right he is, said Carlson. He don't give nobody else a chance to win. He stopped and sniffed the air, and still sniffing, looked down at the old dog. God almighty, that dog stinks. Get him out of here, Candy. I don't know nothing that stinks as bad as an old dog. You gotta get him out. Candy rolled to the edge of his bunk. He reached over and patted the ancient dog, and he apologized. I've been around him so much I never noticed how he stinks. Well, I can't stand him in here, said Carlson. That stink hangs around even after he's gone. He walked over with his heavy-legged stride and looked down at the dog. Got no teeth, he said. He's all stiff with rheumatism. He ain't no good to you, Candy, and he ain't no good to himself. Why don't you shoot him? Candy, the old man squirmed uncomfortably. Well, hell, I had him so long. Had him since he was a pup. I herded sheep with him, he said proudly. You wouldn't think it to look at him now, but he was the best damn sheepdog I ever seen. George said, I seen a guy in Weed that had an Airedale could herd sheep. Learn it from the other dogs. Carlson was not to be put off. Look, Candy, this of dog just suffers himself all the time. If you was to take him out and shoot him right in the back of the head, he leaned over and pointed, right there, why he'd never know what hit him. Candy looked about unhappily. No, he said softly. No, I couldn't do that. I had him too long. He don't have no fun, Carlson insisted. And he stinks to beat hell. Tell you what, I'll shoot him for you. Then it won't be you that does it. Candy threw his legs off his bunk. He scratched the white stubble whiskers on his cheek nervously. I'm so used to him, he said softly. I had him from a pup. Well, you ain't being kind to him keeping him alive, said Carlson. Look, Slim's bitch got a litter right now. I bet Slim would give you one of them PMPs to raise up, wouldn't you, Slim? The skidder had been studying the old dog with his calm eyes. Yeah, he said. You can have a pup if you want to. He seemed to shake himself free for speech. Carl's right, Candy. That dog ain't no good to himself. I wish somebody'd shoot me if I get old and a cripple. Candy looked helplessly at him, for Slim's opinions were law. Maybe it'd hurt him, he suggested. I don't mind taking care of it. Carlson said, the way I'd shoot him, he wouldn't feel nothing. I'd put the gun right there. He pointed with his toe, right back of the head. He wouldn't even quiver. Candy looked for help from face to face. It was quite dark outside by now. A young laboring man came in. His sloping shoulders were bent forward, and he walked heavily on his heels as though he carried the invisible grain bag. He went to his bunk and put his hat on his shelf. Then he picked up a pulp magazine from his shelf and brought it to the light over the table. Did I show you this, Slim? He asked. Show me what? The young man turned to the back of the magazine, put it down on the table and pointed with his finger. Right there, read that. Slim bent over it. Go on, said the young man. Read it out loud. Dear editor, Slim reads slowly. I read your mag for 6 years and I think it is the best on the market. I like stories by Peter Rand. I think he is a winged. Give us more like the Dark Rider. I don't write many letters. Just thought I would tell you I think your mag is the best dime's worth I ever spent. Slim looked up questioningly. What you want me to read that for? Whit said, go on and read the name at the bottom. And Slim read, yours for success, William Tanner. He glanced up at Whit again. What you want me to read that for? Whit closed the magazine impressively. Don't you remember Bill Turner? Worked here about 3 months ago. Slim thought. Little guy, he asked, drove a cultivator. That's him, Whit cried. That's the guy. You think he's the guy wrote this letter? I know it. Bill and me was in here one day. Bill had one of them books that just come. He was looking in it and he says, I wrote a letter. Wonder if they put it in the book. But it wasn't there. Bill says, maybe they're saving it for later. And that's just what they done. There it is. Guess you're right, said Slayton. Got it right in the book. George held out his hand for the magazine. Let's look at it. We'd found the place again. But he did not surrender his hold on it. He pointed out the letter with his forefinger, and then he went to his box shelf and laid the magazine carefully in. I wonder if Bill's seen it, he said. Bill and me worked in that patch of field peas. Run cultivators, both of us. Bill was a hell of a nice fellow. During the conversation, Carlson had refused to be drawn in. He continued to look down at the old dog. Candy watched him uneasily. At last Carlson said, if you want me to, I'll put the old devil out of his misery right now and get it over with. Ain't nothing left for him. Can't eat, can't see, can't even walk without hurting. Candy said hopefully, you ain't got no gun. The hell I ain't. Got a Luger. It won't hurt him none at all. Candy said, maybe tomorrow. Let's wait till tomorrow. I don't see no reason for it, said Carlson. He went to his bunk, pulled his bag from underneath it and took out a Luger pistol. Let's get it over with, he said. We can't sleep with him stinking around in here. He put the pistol in his hip pocket. Candy looked a long time at Slim to try to find some reversal, and Slim gave him none. At last Candy said softly and hopelessly, all right, take it. He did not look down at the dog at all. He lay back on his bunk and crossed his arms behind his head and stared at the ceiling. From his pocket Carlson took a little leather thumb. He stooped over and tied it around the old dog's neck. All the men except Candy watched it. Come boy, come on, boy, he said gently, and he said apologetically to Candy, he won't even feel it. Candy did not move nor answer him. He twitched the thumb. Come on, boy. The old dog got slowly and stiffly to his feet and followed the gently pulling leash. Slim said, Carlson, yeah, you know what to do. What you mean, Slim? Take a shovel, said Slim shortly. Oh, sure, I get you. He led the dog out into the darkness. George followed to the door and shut the door and set the latch gently in its place. Candy lay rigidly on his bed staring at the ceiling. Slim said loudly, one of my lead mules got a bad hoof. Got to get some tar on it. His voice trailed off. It was silent outside. Carlson's footsteps died away. The silence came into the room, and the silence lasted. George chuckled. I bet Lennie's right out there in the barn with his pop. He won't want to come in here no more now he's got a pop. Slim said, Candy, you can have any one of them pops you want. Candy did not answer. The silence fell on the room again. It came out of the night and invaded the room. George said, anybody like to play a little euchre? I'll play out a few with you, said Whit. They took places opposite each other at the table under the light, but George did not shuffle the cards. He rippled the edge of the deck nervously, and the little snapping noise drew out the eyes of all the men in the room, so that he stopped doing it. The silence fell on the room again. A minute passed, and another minute. Candy lay still, staring at the ceiling. Slim gazed at him for a moment, and then looked down at his hands. He subdued one hand with the other, and held it down. There came a little gnawing sound from under the floor and all the men looked down toward it gratefully. Only Candy continued to stare at the ceiling. Sounds like there was a rat under there, said Jane. We ought to get a trap down there. Whit broke out, what the hell's taking him so long? Lay out some cards. Why don't you? We ain't going to get no euchre played this way. George brought the cards together tightly and studied the backs of them. The silence was in the room again. A shot sounded in the distance. The men looked quickly at the old man. Every head turned toward it. For a moment he continued to stare at the ceiling. Then he rolled slowly over and faced the wall and lay silent. George shuffled the cards noisily and dealt them. Whit drew a scoring board to him and set the pegs to start. Whit said, I guess you guys really come here to work. How do you mean? George asked. Whit laughed. Well, you come on a Friday. You got 2 days to work till Sunday. I don't see how you figure, said George. Whit laughed again. You do if you've been around these big ranches much. Guy that wants to look over a ranch comes in Saturday afternoon. He gets Saturday tide supper and 3 meals on Sunday, and he can quit Monday morning after breakfast without turning his hand. But you come to work Friday noon. You got to put in a day and a half no matter how you figure. George looked at him levelly. We're gonna stick around a while, he said. Me and Lennie's gonna roll up a steak. The door opened quietly. and the stable buck put in his head, a lean negro head, lined with pain, the aspirations. Mr. Slayton. Slim took his eyes from old Candy. Hello, Crooks. What's the matter? You told me to warm up tar for that mule's foot. I got it warming. Sure, Crooks. I'll come right out and put it on. I can do it if you want, Mr. Slayton. No, I'll come do it myself. He stood up. Crooks said, Mr. Slayton. Yeah, that big new guy's messing around your pups out in the barn. Well, he ain't doing no harm. I give him one of them pups. Just thought I'd tell ya, said Crooks. He's taking them out the nest and handling them. That won't do them no good. He won't hurt them, said Slayton. I'll come along with you now. George looked up. If that crazy bastard's fooling around too much, just kick him out, Slayton. Slim followed the stable buck out of the room. George dealt and Whit picked up his cards and examined them. Seen the no kid yet? He asked. What kid? George asked. Why, Curly's new wife. Yeah, I seen her. Well, ain't she a Lulu? I ain't seen that much of her, said George. Whit laid down his cards impressively. Well, stick around and keep your eyes open. You'll see plenty. She ain't concealing nothing. I never seen nobody like her. She got the eye going all the time on everybody. I bet she even gives the stable buck the eye. I don't know what the hell she wants. George asked casually. Been any trouble since she got here? It was obvious that Whit was not interested in his cards. He laid his hand down and George scooped it in. George laid out his deliberate solitaire hand 7 cards and 6 on top and 5 on top of those. Whit said, I see what you mean. No, they ain't been nothing yet. Curly's got yellow jackets in his drawers, but that's all so far. Every time the guys is around, she shows up. She's looking for Curly. Or she thought she left something laying around and she's looking for it. Seems like she can't keep away from guys. And Curly's pants is just crawling with ants, but they ain't nothing come of it yet. George said, she's gonna make a mess. There's gonna be a bad mess about her. She's a jailbait all set on the trigger. That Curly got his work cut out for him. Ranch with a bunch of guys on it ain't no place for a girl, especially like her. Whit said, if you got ideas, you ought to come in town with us guys tomorrow night. Why? What's doing? Just the usual thing. We go into old Susie's place. Hell of a nice place. Old Susie's a laugh, always cracking jokes. Like she says when we come up on the front porch last Saturday night. Susie opens the door and then she yells over her shoulder, get your coats on, girls, here comes the sheriff. She never talks dirty, neither. Got 5 girls there. What's it set you back? George asked. 2.5. You can get a shot for 2 hits. Susie got nice chairs to sit in, too. If a guy don't wanna flop, why he can just sit in the chairs and have a couple or 3 shots and pass the time of day, and Susie don't give a damn. She ain't rushing guys through and kicking them out if they don't wanna flop. Might go in and look the joint over, said George. Sure, come along. It's a hell of a lot of fun her cracking jokes all the time. Like she says one time, she says, I've knew people that if they got a rag rug on the floor and a Cupid doll lamp on the phonograph they think they're running a parlor house. That's Clara's house she's talking about. And Susie says, I know what you boys want, she says. My girls is clean, she says. And there ain't no water in my whiskey, she says. If any of you guys want to look at a Cupid doll lamp and take your own chance getting burned, why you know where to go. And she says, there's guys around here walking bow-legged cause they like to look at a Cupid doll lamp. George asked, Clara runs the other house. Huh? Yeah, said Whit. We don't never go there. Clara gets $3 a crack and 35 cents a shot, and she don't crack no jokes. But Susie's place is clean and she got nice chairs. Don't let no cuckoos in, neither. Me and Lennie's rolling up a steak, said George. I might go in and sit and have a shot, but I ain't puffing out no 2.5. Well, a guy got to have some fun sometime, said Whit. The door opened and Lennie and Carlson came in together. Lennie crept to his bunk and sat down, trying not to attract attention. Carlson reached under his bunk and brought out his bag. He didn't look at old Candy, who still faced the wall. Carlson found a little cleaning rod in the bag and a can of oil. He laid them on his bed and then brought out the pistol, took out the magazine and snapped the loaded shell from the chamber. Then he fell to cleaning the barrel with the little rod. When the ejector snapped, Candy turned over and looked for a moment at the gun before he turned back to the wall again. Carlson said casually, Curly been in yet? No, said Whit. What's eating on Curly? Carlson squinted down the barrel of his gun, looking for his old lady. I seen him going round and round outside. Whit said sarcastically. He spends half his time looking for her, and the rest of the time she's looking for him. Curly burst into the room excitedly. Any you guys see my wife? He demanded. She ain't been here, said Whit. Curly looked threateningly about the room. Where the hell sleep? Went out in the barn, said George. He was gonna put some tar on a split hook. Curly's shoulders dropped and squared. How long ago'd he go? 5-10 minutes. Curly jumped out the door and banged it after it. We'd stood up. I guess maybe I'd like to see this, he said. Curly's just spoiling or he wouldn't start for sleep. And Curly's handy, goddamn handy. Got in the finals for the Golden Gloves. He got newspaper clippings about it. He considered, but just the same, he better leave Slim alone. Nobody don't know what Slim can do. Thinks Slim's with his wife, don't he? Said George. Looks like it, we'd said. Course Slim ain't. Least I don't think Slim is. But I like to see the fuss if it comes off. Come on, let's go. George said, I'm staying right here. I don't want to get mixed up in nothing. Lennie and me got to make a stake. Carlson finished the cleaning of the gun and put it in the bag and pushed the bag under his bunk. I guess I'll go out and look her over, he said. Old Candy lay still, and Lennie, from his bunk, watched George cautiously. When Wade and Carlson were gone and the door closed after them, George turned to Lennie. What you got on your mind? I ain't done nothing, George. Slim says I better not pet them pups so much for a while. Slim says it ain't good for them, so I come right in. I been good, George. I coulda told you that, said George. Well, I wasn't hurting them none. I just had mine in my lap petting it. George asked, did you see Slim out in the barn? Sure I did. He told me I better not pet that pup no more. Did you see that girl? You mean Carly's girl? Yeah. Did she come in the barn? No. Anyways, I never seen her. You never seen Slim talking to her. She ain't been in the barn. Okay, said George. I guess them guys ain't gonna see no fight. If there's any fighting, Lennie, you keep out of it. I don't want no fights, said Lennie. He got up from his bunk and sat down at the table across from George. Almost automatically, George shuffled the cards and laid out his solitaire hand. He used a deliberate, thoughtful slowness. Lennie reached for a face card and studied it, then turned it upside down and studied it. Both ends the same, he said. George, why is it both ends the same? I don't know, said George. That's just the way they make at them. What was Slim doing in the barn when you seen him? Slim, sure, you seen him in the barn. And he told you not to pet the pups so much. Oh, yeah, he had a guitar and a paintbrush. I don't know what for. You sure that girl didn't come in like she come in here today? No, she never caught them. George sighed. You give me a good whorehouse every time, he said. A guy can go in and get drunk and get everything out of his system all at once, and no messes. And he knows how much it's gonna set him back. This here jail baits is just set on the trigger of the husigal. Lennie followed his words admiringly, and moved his lips a little to keep up. George continued. You remember Andy Cushman? Lennie went to grammar school? The one that his old lady used to make hot cakes for the kids. Lennie asked. Yeah, that's the one. You can remember anything if there's anything to eat in it. George looked carefully at the solitaire hand. He put an ace up on his scoring rack and piled a 2, 3, and 4 of diamonds on it. Annie's in San Quentin right now on account of a tart, said George. Lennie drummed on the table with his fingers. George, how long's it gonna be till we get that little place and live on the fat of the land and rabbits? I don't know, said George. We gotta get a big steak together. I know a little place we can get cheap. But they ain't giving it away. Old Candy turned slowly over. His eyes were wide open. He watched George carefully. Lennie said, tell about that place, George. I just told you, just last night. Go on, tell again. George. Well, it's 10 acres, said George. Got a little windmill, got a little shack on it, and a chicken run. Got a kitchen, orchard, cherries, apples, peaches, cuts, nuts, got a few berries. There's a place for alfalfa and plenty water to flood it. There's a pig pen and rabbits, George. No place for rabbits now, but I could easily build a few hutches and you could feed alfalfa to the rabbits. Damn right I could, said Lennie. You goddamn right I could. George's hands stopped working with the cards. His voice was growing warmer, and we could have a few pigs. I could build a smokehouse like the one Grandpa had, and when we kill a pig we can smoke the bacon and the hams and make sausage and all like that. And when the salmon run upriver we could catch 100 of them and salt and down or smoke it. We could have them for breakfast. They ain't nothing so nice as smoked salmon. When the fruit come in we could can it, and tomatoes, they're easy to can. Every Sunday we'd kill a chicken or a rabbit. Maybe we'd have a cow or a goat. And the cream is so goddamn thick you got to cut it with a knife and take it out with a spoon. Lennie watched him with wide eyes, and Old Candy watched him too. Lennie said softly, we could live off of the fat of the land. Sure, said George. All kinds of vegetables in the garden. And if we want a little whiskey we can sell a few eggs or something, or some milk. We'd just lie there. We'd belong there. There wouldn't be no more running round the country and getting fed by a Jap cook. No, sir, we'd have our own place where we belonged and not sleep in no bad house. Tell about the house, George, Lennie begged. Sure, we'd have a little house and a room to ourselves. Little fat iron stove, and in the winter we'd keep a fire going in it. It ain't enough land, so we'd have to work too hard. Maybe 6, 7 hours a day. We wouldn't have to pack no barley 11 hours a day. And when we put in a crop, why, we'd be there to take the crop up. We'd know what come of our planting. And rabbits, Lennie said eagerly, and I'd take care of Eden. Tell how I'd do that, George? Sure, you'd go out in the alfalfa patch and you'd have a sack. You'd fill up the sack and bring it in and put it in the rabbit cages. They'd nibble and they'd nibble, said Lennie, the way they do. I seen 'em every 6 weeks or so, George continued. Then those would throw a litter so we'd have plenty rabbits to eat and to sell. And we'd keep a few pigeons to go flying around the windmill like they done when I was a kid. He looked raptly at the wall over Lennie's head. And it'd be our own, and nobody could can us. If we don't like a guy, we can say, get the hell out, and by God he's got to do it. And if a friend come along, why we'd have an extra bunk and we'd say, why don't you spend the night? And by God he would. We'd have a setter dog and a couple striped cats, but you gotta watch out them cats don't get the little rabbits. Lennie breathed hard. You just let them try to get the rabbits. I'll break their goddamn necks. I'll smash it with a stick. He subsided, grumbling to himself, threatening the future cats which might dare to disturb the future rabbits. George sat entranced with his own picture. When Candy spoke, they both jumped as though they had been caught doing something reprehensible. Candy said, you know where's a place like that? George was on guard immediately. I suppose I do, he said. What's that to you? You don't need to tell me where it's at. Might be any place. Sure, said George. That's right. You couldn't find it in 100 years. Candy went on excitedly. How much they want for a place like that? George watched him suspiciously. Well, I could get it for $600. The old people that owns it is flat bust and the old lady needs an operation. Say what's it to you? You got nothing to do with us. Candy said, I ain't much good with only one hand. I lost my hand right here on this ranch. That's why they give me a job swamp it. And they give me $250 cause I lost my hand and I got 50 more saved up right in the bank right now. Thus 300 and I got 50 more coming the end of the month. Tell you what, he leaned forward eagerly. I suppose I went in with you guys. Thus $350 I'd put in. I ain't much good, but I could cook and tend the chickens and hold the garden some. How'd that be? George half closed his eyes. I gotta think about that. We was always gonna do it by ourselves. Candy interrupted him. I'd make a will and leave my share to you guys in case I kick off, cause I ain't got no relatives nor nothing. You guys got any money? Maybe we could do her right now. George spat on the floor disgustedly. We got $10 between us. Then he said thoughtfully, look, if me and Lennie work a month and don't spend nothing, we'll have $100. That'd be $450. I bet we could swing her for that. Then you and Lennie could go get her started and I'd get a job and make up the rest. And you could sell eggs and stuff like that. They fell into a silence. They looked at one another amazed. This thing they had never really believed in was coming true. George said reverently, Jesus Christ, I bet we could swing her. His eyes were full of wonder. I bet we could swing her, he repeated softly. Candy sat on the edge of his bunk. He scratched the stump of his wrist nervously. I got hurt 4 years ago, he said. They'll can me pretty soon. Just as soon as I can swamp out no bunk houses, they'll put me on the county. Maybe if I give you guys my money, you'll let me hoe in the garden even after I ain't no good at it. And I'll wash dishes and little chicken stuff like that. But I'll be on our own place, and I'll be let to work on our own place. He said miserably, you seen what they done to my dog tonight. They says he wasn't no good to himself nor nobody else. When they come here I wish somebody'd shoot me. But they won't do nothing like that. I won't have no place to go, and I can't get no more jobs. I'll have $30 more. Comment time, you guys is ready to quit. George stood up. We'll do her, he said. We'll fix up that little old place and we'll go live there. He sat down again. They all sat still, all bemused by the beauty of the thing. Each mind was popped into the future when this lovely thing should come about. George said wonderingly, I suppose they was a carnival or a circus come to town, or a ball game, or any damn thing. Old Candy nodded in appreciation of the idea. We'd just go to her, George said. We wouldn't ask nobody if we could. Just say, we'll go to her, and we would. Just milk the cow and sling some grain to the chickens and go to her. And put some grass to the rabbits. Lennie broke in. I wouldn't never forget to feed them. When we going to do it, George? In 1 month. Right squawk in 1 month. Know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write to them old people that owns the place that will take it. And Candy'll send $100 to bind her. Sure will, said Candy. They got a good stove there. Sure, got a nice stove, burns coal or wood. I'm gonna take my pop, said Lennie. I bet by Christ he likes it there, by Jesus. Voices were approaching from outside. George said quickly, don't tell nobody about it. Just us three and nobody else. They liable to get us so we can't make no stake. Just go on like we was gonna buck barley the rest of our lives. Then all of a sudden someday we'll go get our pay and scram out of here. Lennie and Candy nodded, and they were grinning with delight. Don't tell nobody, Lennie said to himself. Candy said, George, I ought to have shot that dog myself, George. I shouldn't ought to have let no stranger shoot my dog. The door opened. Slim came in, followed by Curly and Carlson and Whit. Slim's hands were black with tar and he was scowling. Curly hung close to his elbow. Curly said, well, I didn't mean nothing, Slim. I just asked you. Slim said, well, you've been asking me too often. I'm getting goddamn sick of it. If you can't look after your own goddamn wife, what do you expect me to do about it? You lay off of me. I'm just trying to tell you I didn't mean nothing, said Curly. I just thought you might have saw her. Why didn't you tell her to stay the hell home where she belongs? Said Carlson. You let her hang around bunk houses and pretty soon you're gonna have something on your hands. And you won't be able to do nothing about it. Curly whirled on Carlson. You keep out of this lest you wanna step outside. Carlson laughed. You goddamn punk, he said. You tried to throw a scare into Slim and you couldn't make it stick. Slim thrown a scare into you. You're yellow as a frog belly. I don't care if you're the best welter in the country. You come for me and I'll kick your goddamn head off. Candy joined the attack with joy. Glove full of Vaseline, he said disgustedly. Curly glared at him. His eyes slipped on past and lighted on Lennie, and Lennie was still smiling with delight at the memory of the ranch. Curly stepped over to Lennie like a terrier. What the hell you laughing at? Lennie looked blankly at him. Then Curly's rage exploded. Come on, you big bastard. Get up on your feet. No big son of a bitch is gonna laugh at me. I'll show you who's yelling. Lennie looked helplessly at George, and then he got up and tried to retreat. Curly was balanced and poised. He slashed at Lennie with his left, and then smashed down his nose with a right. Lennie gave a cry of terror. Blood welled from his nose. George, he cried. Make let me alone, George. He backed until he was against the wall, and Curly followed, slugging him in the face. Lennie's hands remained at his sides. He was too frightened to defend himself. George was on his feet yelling, Get him, Lennie. Don't let him do it. Lennie covered his face with his huge paws and bleated with terror. He cried, Make him stop, George. Then Curly attacked his stomach and cut off his wind. Slim jumped up. The dirty little rat, he cried, I'll get him myself. George put out his hand and grabbed Slim. Wait a minute, he shouted. He cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, Get him, Lennie. Lennie took his hands away from his face and looked about for George, and Curly slashed at his eyes. The big face was covered with blood. George yelled again, I said get it. Curly's fist was swinging when Lennie reached for it. The next minute Curly was flopping like a fish on a line, and his closed fist was lost in Lennie's big hand. George ran down the road and let go of him, Lennie, let go. But Lennie watched in terror the flopping little man whom he held. Blood ran down Lennie's face. One of his eyes was cut and closed. George slapped him in the face again and again, and still Lennie held onto the closed fist. Curly was white and shrunken by now, and his struggling had become weak. He stood crying, his fist lost in Lennie's paw. George shouted over and over, Let go his hand, Lennie, let go. Slim, come help me while the guy got any hand left. Suddenly Lennie let go his hold. He crouched cowering against the wall. You told me to. George, he said miserably. Curly sat down on the floor, looking in wonder at his crushed hand. Slim and Carlson bent over him. Then Slim straightened up and regarded Lennie with horror. We got to get him into a doctor, he said. Looks to me like every bone in his hand is bust. I didn't want to, Lennie cried. I didn't want to hurt him. Slim said, Carlson, you get the candy wagon hitched up. We'll take him into Solad and get him fixed up. Carlson hurried out. Slim turned to the whimpering Lennie. It ain't your fault. He sighed his puncture-headed comment to him. But Jesus, he ain't hardly got no hand left. Slim hurried out, and in a moment returned with a tin cup of water. He held it to Curly's lips. George said, Slim, will we get canned now? We need the steak. Will Curly's old man can us now? Slim smiled wryly. He knelt down beside Curly. You got your senses in hand enough to listen? He asked. Curly nodded. Well, then listen, Slim went on. I think you got your hand caught in a machine. If you don't tell nobody what happened, we ain't going to. But you just tell and try to get this guy canned and we'll tell everybody. And then will you get the laugh? I won't tell, said Curly. He avoided looking at Lennie. Buggy wheels sounded outside. Slim helped Curly up. Come on now. Carlson's gonna take you to a doctor. He helped Curly out the door. The sound of wheels drew away. In a moment, Slim came back into the bunkhouse. He looked at Lennie, still crouched fearfully against the wall. "Let's see your hands," he asked. Lennie stuck out his hands. "Christ almighty, I hate to have you mad at me," Slim said. George broke in. "Lennie was just scared," he explained. "He didn't know what to do. I told you nobody ought never to fight it." "No, I guess it was Candy I told." Candy nodded solemnly. "That's just what you done," he said. "Right this morning when Curly first lit into your friend, you says, he better not fool with Lennie if he knows what's good for Autumn. That's just what you says to me." George turned to Lennie. "It ain't your fault," he said. "You don't need to be scared no more. You done just what I tell you to. Maybe you better go in the washroom and clean up your face. You look like hell." Lennie smiled with his bruised mouth. "I didn't want no trouble," he said. He walked toward the door, but just before he came to it, he turned back. "George, what you want?" "I can still tend the rabbits, George." "Sure, you ain't done nothing wrong." "I didn't mean no harm, George." "Well, get the hell out and wash your face." Chapter 4. Crooks, the Negro stable buck, had his bunk in the harness room, a little shed that leaned off the wall of the barn. On one side of the little room there was a square 4-pane window, and on the other a narrow plank door leading into the barn. Crook's bunk was a long box filled with straw, on which his blankets were flung. On the wall by the window there were pegs on which hung broken harness in process of being mended, strips of new leather, and under the window itself a little bench for leatherworking tools, curved knives and needles and balls of linen thread, and a small hand riveter. On pegs were also pieces of harness, a split collar with the horsehair stuffing sticking out, a broken hame, and a trace chain with its leather covering split. Crooks had his apple box over his bunk, and in it a range of medicine bottles, both for himself and for the horses. There were cans of saddle soap and a drippy can of tar with its paintbrush sticking over the edge. And scattered about the floor were a number of personal possessions. For, being alone, Crooks could leave his things about, and being a stable buck and a cripple, he was more permanent than the other men, and he had accumulated more possessions than he could carry on his back. Crooks possessed several pairs of shoes, a pair of rubber boots, a big alarm clock, and a single-barreled shotgun. And he had books, too, a tattered dictionary and a mauled copy of the California Civil Code for 1905. There were battered magazines and a few dirty books on a special shelf over his bunk. A pair of large gold-rimmed spectacles hung from a nail on the wall above his bed. This room was swept and fairly neat, for Crooks was a proud, aloof man. He kept his distance and demanded that other people keep theirs. His body was bent over to the left by his crooked spine, and his eyes lay deep in his head, and because of their depth seemed to glitter with intensity. His lean face was lined with deep black wrinkles, and he had thin, pain-tightened lips which were lighter than his face. It was Saturday night. Through the open door that led into the barn came the sound of moving horses, of feet stirring, of teeth champing on hay, of the rattle of halter chains. In the stable box room a small electric globe threw a meager yellow light. Crooks sat on his bunk. His shirt was out of his jeans and back. In one hand he held a bottle of liniment, and with the other he rubbed his spine. Now and then he poured a few drops of the liniment into his pink-palmed hand and reached up under his shirt to rub again. He flexed his muscles against his back and shivered. Noiselessly Lennie appeared in the open doorway and stood there looking in, his big shoulders nearly filling the opening. For a moment Crooks did not see him, but on raising his eyes he stiffened and a scowl came on his face. His hand came out from under his shirt. Lennie smiled helplessly in an attempt to make friends. Crooks said sharply, "You got no right to come in my room. This here's my room. Nobody got any right in here but me." Lennie gulped and his smile grew more fawning. "I ain't doing nothing," he said. "Just come to look at my puppy, and I seen your light," he explained. "Well, I got a right to have a light. You go and get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse, and you ain't wanted in my room." "Why ain't you wanted?" Lennie asked. "'Cause I'm black. They play cards in there, but I can't play because I'm black. They say I stink. Well, I tell you, you all of you stink to me." Lennie flapped his big hands helplessly. "Everybody went into town," he said. "Slim and George and everybody. George says I gotta stay here and not get in no trouble. I seen your light." "Well, what do you want?" "Nothing, I seen your light. I thought I could just come in and sit." Crooks stared at Lennie, and he reached behind him and took down the spectacles and adjusted them over his pink ears and stared again. "I don't know what you're doing in the barn anyway," he complained. "You ain't no Skinner. They's no call for a bucker to come into the barn at all. You ain't no Skinner. You ain't got nothing to do with the horses." "The pop," Lennie repeated. "I come to see my pop." "Well, go see your pop, then, and don't come in a place where you're not wanted." Lennie lost his smile. He advanced a step into the room, then remembered and backed to the door again. I looked at him a little. "Slim says I ain't to pet him very much." Brooks said, well, you been taking him out of the nest all the time. I wonder the old lady don't move him someplace else. Oh, she don't care. She lets me. Lennie had moved into the room again. Brooks scowled, but Lennie's disarming smile defeated him. Come on in and sit a while, Brooks said. Long as you won't get out and leave me alone, you might as well sit down. His tone was a little more friendly. All the boys gone into town, huh? All but old Candy. He just sits in the bunkhouse sharpening his pencil, and sharpening and figuring. Brooks adjusted his glasses. Figuring? What's Candy figuring about? Lennie almost shouted about the rabbits. You're nuts, said Brooks. You're crazy as a wedge. What rabbits you talking about? The rabbits we're gonna get, and I get to tend them, cut grass and give them water and like that. Just nuts, said Brooks. I don't blame the guy you travel with for keeping you out of sight. Lennie said quietly, it ain't no lie. We're gonna do it. Gonna get a little place and live on the fat of the land. Brooks settled himself more comfortably on his bunk. Sit down, he invited. Sit down on the nail keg. Lennie hunched down on the little barrel. You think it's a lie, Lennie said. But it ain't no lie. Every word's the truth, and you can ask George. Brooks put his dark chin into his pink palm. You travel around with George, don't ya? Sure, me and him goes every place together. Brooks continued. Sometimes he talks, and you don't know what the hell he's talking about. Ain't that so? He leaned forward, boring Lennie with his deep eyes. Ain't that so? Yeah, sometimes. Just talks on, and you don't know what the hell it's all about. Yeah, sometimes, but not always. Brooks leaned forward over the edge of the bunk. I ain't a southern Negro, he said. I was born right there in California. My old man had a chicken ranch, about 10 acres. The white kids come to play at our place, and sometimes I went to play with them, and some of them was pretty nice. My old man didn't like that. I never knew till long later why he didn't like that. But I know now. He hesitated, and when he spoke again his voice was softer. There wasn't another colored family for miles around. And now there ain't a colored man on this ranch and there's just one family and so that. He laughed. If I say something, why it's just a nigger saying it, Lennie asked. How long you think it'll be before them pups will be old enough to pet? Brooks laughed again. A guy can talk to you and be sure you won't go blab it. Couple of weeks and them pups will be alright. George knows what he's about. Just talks and you don't understand nothing. He leaned forward excitedly. This is just a nigger talking, and a busted back nigger, so it don't mean nothing, see? You couldn't remember it anyways. I seen it over and over, a guy talking to another guy, and it don't make no difference if you don't hear or understand. The thing is, they're talking, or they're sitting still not talking. It don't make no difference, no difference. His excitement had increased until he pounded his knee with his hand. George can tell you screwy things, and it don't matter. It's just the talking. It's just pain with another guy. That's all. He paused. His voice grew soft and persuasive. I suppose George don't come back no more. I suppose he took a powder and just ain't coming back. What'll you do then? Lennie's attention came gradually to what had been said. What? He demanded. I said I suppose George went into town tonight, and you never heard of him no more. Brooks pressed forward some kind of private victory. Just I suppose that, he repeated. He won't do it, Lennie cried. George wouldn't do nothing like that. I've been with George a long time. He'll come back tonight, but the dog was too much for him. Don't you think he will? Brooks' face lighted with pleasure in his torture. Nobody can tell what a guy'll do. He observed calmly. Let's say he wants to come back and can't. I suppose he gets killed or hurt so he can't come back. Lennie struggled to understand. George won't do nothing like that. He repeated. George is careful. He won't get hurt. He ain't never been hurt, 'cause he's careful. Well, I suppose. Just I suppose he don't come back. What'll you do then? Lennie's face wrinkled with apprehension. I don't know. Say, what you doing anyways? He cried. This ain't true. George ain't got hurt. Brooks poured in on it and want me to tell you what'll happen. They'll take you to the booby hatch. They'll tie you up with a collar like a dog. Suddenly Lennie's eyes centered and grew quiet and mad. He stood up and walked dangerously toward Brooks. Who hurt George? He demanded. Brooks saw the danger as it approached him. He edged back on his bunk to get out of the way. I was just supposing, he said. George ain't hurt. He's alright. He'll be back alright. Lennie stood over him. What you supposing for? Ain't nobody going to suppose no hurt to George. Brooks removed his glasses and wiped his eyes with his fingers. Just sit down, he said. George ain't hurt. Lennie growled back to his seat on the nail keg. Ain't nobody going to talk no hurt to George, he grumbled. Brooks said gently, maybe you can see now. You got George. You know he's going to come back. I suppose you didn't have nobody. I suppose you couldn't go into the bunkhouse and play Ronnie 'cause you was black. How'd you like that? I suppose you had to sit out here and read books. Sure, you could play horseshoes till it got dark, but then you got to read books. Books ain't no good. A guy needs somebody to be near him. He whined, a guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. Don't make no difference who the guy is, long's he's with you. I tell ya, he cried, I tell ya a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. George gonna come back. Lennie reassured himself in a frightened voice. Maybe George come back already. Maybe I better go see. Crooks said, I didn't mean to scare you. He'll come back. I was talking about myself. A guy sits alone out here at night, maybe reading books or thinking or stuff like that. Sometimes he gets thinking, and he got nothing to tell him what's so and what ain't so. Maybe if he sees something. He don't know whether it's right or not. He can't turn to some other guy and ask him if he sees it too. He can't tell. He got nothing to measure by. I seen things out here. I wasn't drunk. I don't know if I was asleep. If some guy was with me, he could tell me I was asleep and then it would be alright. But I just don't know. Crooks was looking across the room now, looking toward the window. Lennie said miserably, George won't go away and leave me. I know George won't do that. His stable buck went on dreamily. I remember when I was a little kid on my old man's chicken ranch. I had two brothers. They was always near me. Always there. Used to sleep right in the same room, right in the same bed all three. Had a strawberry patch. Had an alfalfa patch. Used to turn the chickens out in the alfalfa on a sunny morning. My brothers sat on a fence rail and watched and white chickens they was. Gradually Lennie's interest came around to what was being said. George says we're gonna have alfalfa for the rabbits. What rabbits? We're gonna have rabbits and a berry patch. You're nuts. We are too. You asked George. You're nuts. Crooks was scornful. I seen hundreds of men come by on the road and on the ranches, with their Bibles on their back and that same damn thing in their heads. Hundreds of them. And they come and they quit and go on, and every damn one of them's got a little piece of land in his head. And never a goddamn one of them ever gets it. Just like heaven. Everybody wants a little piece of land. I read plenty of books out here. Nobody never gets to heaven, and nobody gets no land. It's just in their head. They're all the time talking about it, but it's just in their head. He paused and looked toward the open door, for the horses were moving restlessly and the halter chains clinked. A horse whinnied. I guess somebody's out there, Crooks said. Maybe Slim. Slim comes in sometimes 2, 3 times a night. Slim's a real skinner. He looks out for his team. He pulled himself painfully upright and moved toward the door. That you, Slim, he called. Candy's voice answered. Slim went in town. Say, you seen Lennie? You mean the big guy? Yeah, seen him around any place. He's in here, Crooks said shortly. He went back to his bunk and lay down. Candy stood in the doorway scratching his bald wrist and looking blindly into the lighted room. He made no attempt to enter. Tell you what, Lennie, I've been figuring out about them rabbits. Crooks said irritably, you can come in if you want. Candy seemed embarrassed. I do know. Of course, if you want me to. Come on in. If everybody's coming in, you might just as well. It was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger. Candy came in, but he was still embarrassed. You got a nice cozy little place in here, he said to Crooks. Must be nice to have a room all to yourself this way. Sure, said Crooks, and a manure pile under the window. Sure, it's swell. Lennie broke in. You said about them rabbits. Candy leaned against the wall beside the broken collar while he scratched the wrist stump. I've been here a long time, he said. And Crooks been here a long time. This is the first time I ever been in his room. Crooks said darkly. Guys don't come into a colored man's room very much. Nobody been here but Slim and the boss. Candy quickly changed the subject. Slim's as good a skidder as I ever seen. Lennie leaned toward the old swamper about them rabbits. He insisted. Candy smiled. I got it figured out. We can make some money on them rabbits if we go about it right. But I get to tend them. Lennie broke in. George says I get to tend that, and he promised. Crooks interrupted brutally. You guys is just kidding yourself. You'll talk about it a hell of a lot, but you won't get no land. You'll be a swamper here till they take you out in a box. Hell, I seen too many guys. Lennie here'll quit and be on the road in 2, 3 weeks. Seems like every guy got land in his head. Candy rubbed his cheek angrily. You goddamn right we're gonna do it. George says we are. We got the money right now. Yeah, said Crooks. And where's George now? In town in a whorehouse. That's where your money's going. Jesus, I seen it happen too many times. I seen too many guys with land in their head. They never get none under their hand. Candy cried. Sure they all want it. Everybody wants a little bit of land, not much. Just something that was his. Something he could live on and there couldn't nobody throw him off of it. I never had none. I planted crops for damn near everybody in this state, but they wasn't my crops, and when I harvested them, it wasn't none of any harvest. But we gonna do it now. And don't you make no mistake about that. George ain't got the money in town. That money's in the bank. Me and Lennie and George, we gonna have a room to ourselves. We're gonna have a dog and rabbits and chickens. We're gonna have green corn and maybe a cow or a goat. He stopped, overwhelmed with his picture. Crooks asked, "You say you got the money?" "Damn right. We got most of it. Just a little bit more to get. Have it all in 1 month." George got the land all picked out, too. Crooks reached around and explored his spine with his hand. "I never seen a guy really do it," he said. "I seen guys nearly crazy with loneliness for land, but every time a whorehouse or a blackjack game took what it takes." He hesitated. "If you guys would want a hand to work for nothing just his keep, why I'd come and lend a hand. I ain't so crippled I can't work like a son of a bitch if I want to." "Any you boys seen Carly?" They swung their heads toward the door. Looking in was Carly's wife. Her face was heavily made up. Her lips were slightly parted. She breathed strongly as though she had been running. "Carly ain't been here," Candy said sourly. She stood still in the doorway, smiling a little at them, rubbing the nails of one hand with the thumb and forefinger of the other, and her eyes traveled from one face to another. "They left all the weak ones here," she said finally. "Think I don't know where they all went. Even Carly, I know where they all went." Lennie watched her, fascinated, but Candy and Crooks were scowling down away from her eyes. Candy said, "Then if you know, why you want to ask us where Curly is at?" She regarded them amusedly. "Funny thing," she said. "If I catch any one man, and he's alone, I get along fine with it. But just let two of the guys get together and you won't talk. Just nothing but mad." She dropped her fingers and put her hands on her hips. "You're all scared of each other, that's what. Ever one of you's scared the rest is going to get something on you." After a pause, Crooks said, "Maybe you better go along to your own house now. We don't want no trouble." "Well, I ain't giving you no trouble. Think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while. Think I like to stick in that house a flat time." Candy laid the stump of his wrist on his knee and rubbed it gently with his hand. He said accusingly, "You got a husband. You got no cow fooling around with other guys, causing trouble." The girl flared up. "Sure I got a husband. You all seen him. Swell guy, ain't he? Spends all his time saying what he's gonna do to guys he don't like, and he don't like nobody. Think I'm gonna stay in that 2x4 house and listen how Curly's gonna lead with his left twig, and then bring in the upright cross. 1-2 he says. Just the of 1-2 and he'll go down." She paused and her face lost its sullenness and grew interested. "Say what happened to Curly's band." There was an embarrassed silence. Candy stole a look at Lennie. Then he coughed. "Why, Curly, he got his hand caught in a machine, ma'am." "But his band." She watched for a moment and then she laughed. "Baloney, what you think you're selling me?" Curly started something he didn't finish. "Caught in a machine, baloney. Why, he ain't give nobody the good of one was since he got his band bust." "Who busted it?" Candy repeated sullenly. "Got it caught in a machine." "All right," she said contemptuously. "All right, cover him up if you want to. What do I care? You bindle bums think you're so damn good. What do you think I am, a kid? I tell ya I could have went with shows. Not just one, neither. And a guy told me he could put me in pictures." She was breathless with indignation. "Saturday night. Everybody out doing something. Everybody. And what am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of Bible stiffs, a nigger and a dum-dum and a lousy of sheep and ordering it because they ain't nobody else." Lennie watched her, his mouth half open. Crooks had retired into the terrible protective dignity of the Negro. But a change came over old Candy. He stood up suddenly and knocked his nail keg over backward. "I had enough," he said angrily. "You ain't wanted here. We told you you ain't. And I tell ya, you got flusy ideas about what us guys amounts to. You ain't got sense enough in that chicken head to even see that we ain't stiffs. I s'pose you get us canned. I s'pose you do. You think we'll hit the highway and look for another lousy 2-bit job like this. You don't know that we got our own ranch to go to and our own house. We ain't got to stay here. We got a house and chickens and fruit trees and a place 100 times prettier than this. And we got friends, that's what we got. Maybe there was a time when we was scared of getting canned, but we ain't no more. We got our own land. And it's ours, and we seen go to it." Curly's wife laughed at it. "And baloney," she said. "I seen too many you guys. If you had 2 bits in the world, why you'd be in getting 2 shots of corn with it and sucking the bottom of the glass. I know you guys." Candy's face had grown redder and redder, but before she was done speaking, he had control of himself. He was the master of the situation. "I might have knew," he said gently. "Maybe you just better go along and roll your hoop. We ain't got nothing to say to you at all. We know what we got. And we don't care whether you know it or not. So maybe you better just scatter along now, cause Curly maybe ain't gonna like his wife out in the barn with us bindle stiffs." She looked from one face to another, and they were all closed against her. And she looked longest at Lennie until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. Suddenly she said, "Where'd you get them bruises on your face?" Lennie looked up guiltily. "Who, me?" "Yeah, you." Lennie looked to Candy for help, and then he looked at his lap again. "He got his hand caught in a machine," he said. Curly's wife laughed. "Okay, machine. I'll talk to you later. I like machines." Candy broke it. "You let this guy alone. Don't you do no messing around with it. I'm gonna tell George what you says." "George, one of you messing with Lennie?" "Who's George?" she asked. "The little guy you come with." Lennie smiled happily. "That's him," he said. "That's the guy, and he's gonna let me tend the rabbits." "Well, if that's all you want, I might get a couple rabbits myself." Brooks stood up from his bunk and faced her. "I had enough," he said coldly. "You got no rights coming in a colored man's room. You got no rights messing around in here at all. Now you just get out, and get out quick. If you don't, I'm gonna ask the boss not to ever let you come in the barn no more." She turned on him in scorn. "Listen, nigger," she said. "You know what I can do to you if you open. You're trapped." Brooks stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and drew into himself. She closed on him, and "You know what I could do." Brooks seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. "Yes, man. Well, you keep your place then, nigger. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny." Brooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and his voice was toneless. For a moment she stood over him, as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again. But Crooks sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might be heard drowned in him. She turned at last to the other two. Old Candy was watching her, fascinated. "If you was to do that, we'd tell," he said quietly. "We'd tell about you frowning Crooks." "Tell and be damned," she cried. "Nobody'd listen to you, and you know it. Nobody'd listen to you." Candy subsided. "No," he agreed. "Nobody'd listen to us." Lennie whined, "I wish George was here. I wish George was here." Candy stepped over to him. "Don't you worry none," he said. "I just heard the guys coming in. George'll be in the bunkhouse right now, I bet." He turned to Curly's wife. "You better go home now," he said quietly. "If you go right now, we won't tell Curly you was here." She appraised him coolly. "I ain't sure you heard nothing." "Better not take no chances," he said. "If you ain't sure, you better take the safe way." She turned to Lennie. "I'm glad you bust up Curly a little bit. He got it coming to him. Sometimes I'd like to bust him myself." She slipped out the door and disappeared into the dark barn. And while she went through the barn, the halter chains rattled, and some horses snorted and some stamped their feet. Brooks seemed to come slowly out of the layers of protection he bad put on. "Was that the truth what you said about the guys come back?" he asked. "Sure, I heard at them." "Well, I didn't hear nothing." "The gate banged," Candy said, and he went on, "Jesus Christ, Curly's wife can move quiet. I guess she had a lot of practice, though." Brooks avoided the whole subject now. "Maybe you guys better go," he said. "I ain't sure I want you in here no more. A colored man got to have some rights even if he don't like it." Candy said, "That bitch didn't ought to have said that to you." "It wasn't nothing," Crooks said dully. "You guys coming in and said it made me forget. What she says is true." The horses snorted out in the barn and the chains rang and a voice called, "Lennie." "Oh, Lennie, you in the barn." "It's George," Lennie cried. And he answered, "Here, George. I'm right in here." In a second George stood framed in the door, and he looked disapprovingly about. "What you doing in Crooks' room? You hadn't ought to lie here." Crooks nodded. "I told them, but they come in anyways." "Well, why didn't you kick 'em out?" "I didn't care much," said Crooks. "Lennie's a nice fella." Now Candy aroused himself. "Oh, George, I've been figuring and figuring. I got it doped out how we can even make some money on them rabbits." George scowled. "I thought I told you not to tell nobody about that." Candy was crestfallen. "Didn't tell nobody but Crooks." George said, "Well, you guys get out of here." "Jesus, seems like I can't go away for a minute." Candy and Lennie stood up and went toward the door. Crooks called, "Candy, remember what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs?" "Yeah," said Candy, "I remember." "Well, just forget it," said Crooks. "I didn't mean it. Just fool it. I wouldn't want to go no place like that." "Well, okay, if you feel like that. Good night." The three men went out of the door. As they went through the barn, the horses snorted and the halter chains rattled. Crooks sat on his bunk and looked at the door for a moment, and then he reached for the liniment bottle. He pulled out his shirt and bag, poured a little liniment in his pink palm, and reaching around, he fell slowly to rubbing his back. Chapter 5. One end of the great barn was piled high with new hay, and over the pile hung the 4-talon Jackson fork suspended from its pulley. The hay came down like a mountain slope to the other end of the barn, and there was a level place as yet unfilled with the new crop. At the sides the feeding racks were visible, and between the slats the heads of horses could be seen. It was Sunday afternoon. The resting horses nibbled the remaining wisps of hay, and they stamped their feet and they beat the wood of the mangers and rattled the halter chains. The afternoon sun sliced in through the cracks of the barn walls and lay in bright lines on the hay. There was the buzz of flies in the air, the lazy afternoon humming. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the playing peg, and the shouts of men, playing, encouraging, jeering. But in the barn it was quiet and humming and lazy and warm. Only Lennie was in the barn, and Lennie sat in the hay beside a packing case under a manger in the end of the barn that had not been filled with hay. Lennie sat in the hay and looked at a little dead puppy that lay in front of it. Lennie looked at it for a long time, and then he put out his huge hand and stroked it clear from one end to the other, and Lennie said softly to the puppy, "Why do you got to get killed? You ain't so little as mice. I didn't bounce you hard." He bent the pup's head up and looked in its face, and he said to it, "Now maybe George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits if he finds out you got killed." He scooped a little hollow and laid the puppy in it and covered it over with hay out of sight, but he continued to stare at the mound he had made. He said, "This ain't no bad thing like I got to go hide in the brush. Oh, no, this ain't. I'll tell George I found it dead." He unburied the puppy and inspected it, and he stroked it from ears to tail. He went on sorrowfully, "But he'll know. George always knows. He'll say, 'You done it. Don't try to put nothing over on me.' And he'll say, 'Now just for that you don't get to tend no rabbits.'" Suddenly his anger arose. "God damn you," he cried. "Why do you got to get killed? You ain't so little as mice." He picked up the pup and hurled it from him. He turned his back on it. He sat bent over his knees and he whispered, "Now I won't get to tend the rabbits. Now he won't let me." He rocked himself back and forth in his sorrow. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the iron stake, and then a little chorus of cries. Lennie got up and brought the puppy back and laid it on the hay and sat down. He stroked the pup again. "You wasn't big enough," he said. "They told me you wasn't. I didn't know you'd get killed so easy." He worked his fingers on the pup's limp ear. "Maybe George won't care," he said. This here goddamn little son of a bitch wasn't nothing to George. Curly's wife came around the end of the last stall. She came very quietly, so that Lennie didn't see her. She wore her bright cotton dress and the mules with the red ostrich feathers. Her face was made up and the little sausage curls were all in place. She was quite near to him before Lennie looked up and saw her. In a panic, he shoveled hay over the puppy with his fingers. He looked sullenly up at her. She said, "What you got there, sonny boy?" Lennie glared at her. "George says I ain't to have nothing to do with you talk to you or nothing." She laughed. "George giving you orders about everything." Lennie looked down at the hay. "Says I can't tend no rabbits if I talk to you or anything." She said quietly, "He's scared Curly'll get mad." Well, Curly got his arm in a sling, and if Curly gets tough, you can break his other hand. You didn't put nothing over on me about getting it caught in no machine. But Lennie was not to be drawn. "No, sir, I ain't gonna talk to you or nothing." She knelt in the hay beside it. "Listen," she said, "all the guys got a horseshoe tenement going on. It's only about 4 o'clock. None of them guys is going to leave that tenement. Why can't I talk to you? I never get to talk to nobody. I get awful lonely." Lennie said, "Well, I ain't supposed to talk to you or nothing." "I get lonely," she said. "You can talk to people, but I can't talk to nobody but Curly, else he gets mad. How'd you like not to talk to anybody?" Lennie said, "Well, I ain't supposed to. George is scared I'll get in trouble." She changed the subject. "What you got covered up there?" Then all of Lennie's woe came back on him. "Joe, my pup," he said sadly, "just my little pup." And he swept the hay from on top of it. "Why, he's dead," she cried. "He was so little," said Lennie. "I was just playing with it, and he made like he's gonna bite me, and I made like I was gonna smack it. And I done it, and then he was dead." She consoled him. "Don't you worry none. He was just a mutt. You can get another one easy. The whole country is full of mutts. It ain't that so much," Lennie explained miserably. "George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits now. Why don't he?" "Well," he said, "if I done any more bad things, he ain't gonna let me tend the rabbits." She moved closer to him and she spoke soothingly. "Don't you worry about talking to me. Listen to the guys yell out there. They got $4 bet in that tenement. None of them ain't gonna leave till it's over. If George sees me talking to you, he'll give me hell," Lennie said cautiously. "He told me so." Her face grew angry. "What's the matter with me?" she cried. "Ain't I got a right to talk to nobody? What do they think I am? Anyways, you're a nice guy. I don't know why I can't talk to you. I ain't doing no harm to you." "Well, George says you'll get us in a mess." "Oh, nuts," she said. "What kind of harm am I doing to you? Seems like they ain't none of them cares how I got alive. I tell you I ain't used to living like this. I could have made something of myself." She said darkly, "Maybe I will yet." And then her words tumbled out in a passion of communication, as though she hurried before her listener could be taken away. "I live right in Salinas," she said. come there when I was a kid. Well, a show come through, and I met one of the actors. He says I could go with that show, but my off lady wouldn't let me. She says because I was only 15. But the guy says I couldn't. If I'd went, I wouldn't be living like this, you bet. Lennie stroked the pup back and forth. We're gonna have a little place and rabbits, he explained. She went on with her story quickly before she should be interrupted. Another time I met a guy, and he was in pictures. Went out to the Riverside Dance Palace with him. He says he was gonna put me in the movies. Says I was a natural. Soon as he got back to Hollywood, he was gonna write to me about it. She looked closely at Lennie to see whether she was impressing it. I never got that letter, she said. I always thought my off lady stole it. Well, I wasn't gonna stay no place where I couldn't get nowhere or make something of myself, and where they stole your letters. I asked her if she stole it too, and she says no. So I married Curly, met him out to the Riverside Dance Palace that same night. She demanded, you listen in. Me, sure. Well, I ain't told this to nobody before. Maybe I ought to. I don't like Curly. He ain't a nice fella. And because she had confided in him, she moved closer to Lennie and sat beside him. Could have been in the movies and had nice clothes, all them nice clothes like they wear. And I could have sat in them big hotels and had pictures took of me. When they had them previews, I could have went to them and spoke in the radio, and it wouldn't have cost me a cent because I was in the picture. And all them nice clothes like they wear, because this guy says I was a natural. She looked up at Lennie, and she made a small grand gesture with her arm and hand to show that she could act. The fingers trailed after her leading wrist, and her little fingers stuck out grandly from the rest. Lennie sighed deeply. From outside came the clang of a horseshoe on metal, and then a chorus of cheers. Somebody made a ringer, said Curly's wife. Now the light was lifting as the sun went down, and the sun streaks climbed up the wall and fell over the feeding racks and over the heads of the horses. Lennie said, maybe if I took this pup out and throw him away, George wouldn't never know, and then I could tend the rabbits without any trouble. Curly's wife said angrily, don't you think of nothing but rabbits. We're gonna have a little place, Lennie explained patiently. We're gonna have a house and a garden and a place for alfalfa. And that alfalfa is for the rabbits, and I take a sack and get it all full of alfalfa, and then I take it to the rabbits. She asked, what makes you so nuts about rabbits? Lennie had to think carefully before he could come to a conclusion. He moved cautiously close to her until he was right against her. I like to pet nice things. Once at a fair I seen some of them long-haired rabbits, and they was nice, you bet. Sometimes I'd even pet mice, but not when I could get nothing better. Curly's wife moved away from him a little. I think you're nuts, she said. No, I ain't, Lennie explained earnestly. George says I ain't. I like to pet nice things with my fingers, soft things. She was a little bit reassured. Well, who don't? She said. Everybody likes that. I like to feel silk and velvet. Do you like to feel velvet? Lennie chuckled with pleasure. You bet, by God, he cried happily, and I had some too. A lady gave me some, and that lady was my own Aunt Clara. She gave it right to me about this big a piece. I wished I had that velvet right now. A frown came over his face. I lost it, he said. I ain't seen it for a long time. Curly's wife laughed at him. You're nuts, she said. But you're a kinda nice fella, just like a big baby, but a person can see kinda what you mean when I'm doing it.